Section 1. Where it all began, the origin details hiding inside the pilot. There is something deeply satisfying about a show that rewards the patient viewer. The kind of show where, after you have watched it dozens of times, you still find yourself pausing the frame, leaning slightly forward, and squinting at something you are almost certain you just caught in the corner of the screen. Family Guy is that show. It has always been that show. From the very first frames of its very first episode, all the way through to the most recent seasons that are still unfolding. And tonight, we are going to get into all of it. Every buried detail, every blink and miss it reference, every piece of production lore and animator mischief and background gag that the writers smuggled in when they thought nobody was watching closely enough. So settle in. Let the ambient sound of Quahog wash over you. Get comfortable. Let's begin somewhere most people never think to look, the beginning. The story of how Family Guy got made is itself full of hidden details that most casual fans have never really explored. Seth MacFarlane was 23 years old when he pitched a 15-minute animated pilot to Fox in May of 1998. But the show did not spring fully formed from his imagination in one moment. It had been building for years, through a series of small, scrappy, creative steps that left fingerprints all over the final product. Fingerprints that are still visible if you know where to look. MacFarlane grew up in Kent, Connecticut, a small New England town about as far from Hollywood as a place can feel. By the time he was 5 years old, he already knew he wanted to make cartoons. His parents found him a book about flip animation, and he was gone. By 9, he was publishing a weekly comic strip called Walter Crouton in his local newspaper, earning $5 whole per week. He already had the instinct of someone who thought in jokes and frames, someone whose mind organized the world into setups and punchlines. He attended the Rhode Island School of Design, which is where several crucial pieces of the Family Guy puzzle came together quietly, without fanfare. The voice of Peter Griffin was not invented at a writing desk. It came from a real person. Specifically, it came from a security guard who worked at the Rhode Island School of Design, a man whose way of speaking MacFarlane and his friends found so genuinely funny that they would apparently seek out reasons to walk past him just to hear it. That voice, that particular cadence and quality, became the template for the most famous fictional working-class father in animated television history. There is something wonderful about that. Every time Peter Griffin opens his mouth, somewhere embedded in those vowels and that particular rhythm, there is a real human being that nobody ever talks about. A security guard at an art school who never knew he was being recorded in someone's memory. The voice of Stewie Griffin has an equally fascinating origin. MacFarlane has described Stewie as an evil Rex Harrison, and that comparison is not arbitrary. Rex Harrison was an English actor who starred in the 1964 musical film My Fair Lady, in which he played Professor Henry Higgins, a meticulous and condescending phonetics expert who believed that the way a person speaks determines everything about who they are and how the world receives them. MacFarlane modeled Stewie's vocal performance directly on Harrison's interpretation of Higgins, particularly that arch, theatrical, slightly theatrical quality of someone who is performing their own sophistication at all times. The character is, at his core, a baby who speaks exactly the way a person would speak if they had spent their entire conscious life trying to prove they were better than everyone around them. And that voice is a direct line back to a 1960s musical that most Family Guy viewers have probably never sat through. Brian Griffin's voice is perhaps the simplest origin of all, and that simplicity is part of the joke. Seth MacFarlane voices Brian using something very close to his own natural speaking voice, with what he has described as a slight uptick in smarminess. The idea was that Brian is the character who is most like how MacFarlane himself might sound if he were placed into this absurd fictional world, the one who can hear what everyone else is doing and think, quietly, that things could perhaps be approached with a bit more intelligence. Brian is MacFarlane's surrogate, which makes the later decline of Brian's character feel somewhat personal to people who understood this from the beginning. The show was originally supposed to go in a completely different direction from its first frames. Before Fox gave MacFarlane the green light for a full series, the plan had been for Family Guy to exist as a series of short animated inserts for the sketch comedy program MAD-TV. The budget limitations of that production ultimately scuttled the idea, but the DNA of that original format, quick, punchy, self-contained comedic bursts, never fully left the show. The cutaway gag format that defines Family Guy's identity is arguably a direct descendant of that original sketch comedy intention. Even when MacFarlane was pitching a full sitcom to Fox, something in him was still making a show designed to work in small, independent pieces. That tension between this is an episode with a story and this is a delivery system for standalone jokes runs through every season of the show's entire history. And there is one more hidden detail about the show's creation that fans rarely discuss. MacFarlane got the meeting at Fox partly because of timing. When he first approached the network, they were hesitant. Adding another adult animated comedy felt redundant. Mike Judge had just signed a deal for King of the Hill, and Fox was uncertain about overloading their Sunday nights with cartoons. MacFarlane was initially turned away. He came back a year later, after King of the Hill had proven that adult animation could hold an audience and earn critical respect, and this time Fox gave him $50,000 to create a pilot. The show that exists with all its hundreds of millions of viewers and decades of broadcast history came down partly to the success of a different show about a different cartoon family in Texas. Boomhauer and Dale Gribble, in some small and strange way, helped Peter and Lois Griffin get on television. Now let us talk about what MacFarlane actually put into that pilot, and what people have missed every time they watched it. The first episode of Family Guy, titled Death Has a Shadow, aired on the 31st of January 1999, immediately following Super Bowl 33. That premiere slot was network gold. Millions of people who had just been watching football suddenly had a new animated show dropped in front of them, whether they were looking for it or not. The result was a staggering 22 million viewers for that first episode, a number that genuinely belongs in a different category from what the show would achieve in its quieter moments in later years. But within that premiere episode, tucked in and unannounced, were several details that set up the entire mythology of the show going forward. The opening moments establish something that most viewers process as wallpaper, but which is actually a deliberate tribute. The theme sequence, with Peter and Lois seated at a piano together, the camera pulling back to reveal the familiar neighborhood, is a direct and intentional homage to the opening of All in the Family, the Norman Lear sitcom from the 1970s in which Archie and Edith Bunker sit at their upright piano and sing about the old days. MacFarlane has spoken openly about his deep admiration for Lear's work, and the way Lear-produced shows dealt with genuinely controversial social material through the lens of a dysfunctional but fundamentally loving family. The Family Guy opening is not just a stylistic choice, it is a statement of intent. It says, from the very first second, that this show sees itself as a descendant of that tradition, a cartoon that wants to earn the right to be offensive by also being warm. Within the pilot episode itself, in the very first scene in which we see Stewie at the breakfast table, something remarkable is happening that most viewers completely miss on first watch. Stewie is sitting in his high chair, tinkering with a device that looks vaguely like a toy, and he says, in that clipped and precise accent, that his mind control device is nearing completion. Lois dismisses it as a toy and takes it away. What makes this moment extraordinary is not the joke itself, but the way it is framed. The adults in the room do not react with alarm or surprise. They process the baby's elaborate monologue about a mind control device the way one might process a toddler babbling about their stuffed rabbit. The comedy engine that will power Stewie's entire arc across the early seasons of the show is visible in that very first scene, fully assembled and running. Stewie is capable of extraordinary things, and the people around him refuse to perceive them. The dramatic gap between what Stewie is and what the adults see when they look at him is established not through explanation but through action in the first 2 minutes of the first episode. Also in that pilot, the first 4 episode titles were done in the style of 1940s film noir. Death Has a Shadow reads like the name of a Humphrey Bogart picture, not an animated sitcom about a welfare fraud incident in suburban Rhode Island. This was intentional. The writing staff briefly considered using that kind of evocative, noir-adjacent naming convention for all the episodes going forward, before realizing fairly quickly that the titles were making the show harder to track and categorize, both for the network and for the audience. The idea was quietly dropped, but those first 4 episode names stand as a small surviving trace of a slightly different tonal register that Family Guy briefly considered occupying. There is also something happening with the pilot's animation that most viewers either never noticed or simply did not know to look for. The original pilot was produced as a 15-minute pitch reel, hand-animated by McFarlane, working largely alone, before the show was fully staffed and in production. The final broadcast version of the first episode was reanimated for television with a full crew, but certain details from the pitch version made it into the final cut in slightly altered forms. The Shoulder Devil and Shoulder Angel gag in the first episode, where Peter's moral and immoral impulses are represented as tiny figures on his shoulders, includes a moment where the angel is stuck in traffic and has not arrived yet. That specific joke, with its inherent absurdist logic that even the metaphysical forces governing Peter's conscience are subject to Rhode Island traffic, was present in the original pitch reel and survived all the way through to broadcast intact. It is a small thing, but it tells you something about how deliberate McFarlane's original vision was. The jokes in those early drafts were specific enough and confident enough to survive the entire production process without needing to be replaced or updated. One detail from the pilot that carries more weight in retrospect than it possibly could have on its original air date is the dynamic between Brian and Stewie. In the very first episode, Brian and Stewie's relationship is not a friendship. It is something closer to mutual hostility, with a thin layer of reluctant proximity on top. Brian is not charmed by Stewie in those early scenes. He looks at the baby the way a slightly weary adult looks at a strange and unpredictable child who has been placed in their care by circumstances they did not volunteer for. The warmth between them has not been invented yet. That warmth would develop slowly across the first 2 seasons, through incremental scenes and small shared moments, until by the time Road to Rhode Island aired midway through Season 2, the Brian and Stewie dynamic had become one of the most distinctive comedic pairings in animated television. But looking back at that pilot episode knowing everything the show would become, there is something almost touching about seeing these two characters in their very earliest form before they were friends. The pilot also contains the first appearance, in background, of a detail that would recur throughout the show's entire run without ever being explicitly called out. In the Griffin living room, on the wall behind the couch, there are 2 framed pictures of a mountain. Just a mountain. No explanation, no context. For years, fans speculated about what this mountain was and why the production designers had chosen it, whether it was a real location or something the animators had simply generated as generic landscape art. It was not until Season 18, in an episode called Catfight, that the mystery was resolved. Stewie, in a throwaway line during a scene that was not really about the pictures at all, identifies the mountain in the framed artwork as Mount Quahog, a small fictional Rhode Island mountain, a piece of background scenery that had been sitting on the wall of the Griffin living room since 1999, asking a question nobody could answer until the show finally got around to answering it almost 2 decades later. That is the kind of patience this show has always had in its best moments. It plants a detail, lets it breathe for years, and then rewards the people who were paying attention. Hey, before we go any further, drop a comment down below and tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight and what time it is wherever you are. I love seeing where these videos reach. And if you are enjoying what you are hearing, hit subscribe. It is completely free and it genuinely helps this channel grow. Okay, back to Quahog. Section 2. The Griffin House and the Hidden Geography of Quahog. The house at 31 Spooner Street is one of the most recognizable addresses in animated television, and it is also one of the most quietly strange. If you have ever spent any real time thinking about the physical layout of the Griffin home, and not just the way it looks on the outside, but the actual spatial logic of how the rooms relate to one another, you will have arrived at the same conclusion that architectural pedants and deeply committed fans have arrived at across decades of careful viewing. The house does not make physical sense, and the production team was absolutely aware of this. The exterior of the house is that familiar 2-story colonial structure with white clapboard siding, a dark front door, a modest front porch, and a green lawn that seems to connect seamlessly to every neighboring property. The Swanson house is directly across the street. The Brown house was next door until Cleveland departed for his own spin-off. The Drunken Clam is apparently within walking distance, though the exact route and distance changes between episodes depending on what the story requires. This geographic flexibility is not accidental. The producers made a conscious decision from very early on to let the world of Quahog be somewhat elastic, expanding and contracting based on the needs of any given episode, rather than adhering to a fixed map that would constrain storytelling. Inside the house, things get even more interesting. The living room floor, if you watch carefully across the early seasons of the show, is yellow. Not a subtle or ambiguous yellow, a noticeably warm yellow floor that forms the baseline of several interior scenes during seasons 1 through 3. At some point during the show's run, that floor quietly becomes green. Nobody announces this. Nobody in any episode draws attention to it. The floor simply changes color between one era of the show and another, and it keeps its new color from that point forward. The circular rug between the couch and the television also changes color periodically. The pictures on the wall shift in subtle ways. The details of the kitchen background vary from episode to episode. The show was never designed to be a precisely consistent piece of architectural fiction, and the production designers seem to have accepted early on that a certain amount of fluid inconsistency was simply going to be a part of the show's nature. But some things in that house are remarkably consistent, and those consistent details tell you things. Stewie's bedroom is on the second floor, down the hall from Peter and Lois's room. In the early seasons, the room is a fairly standard nursery setup: a crib, a changing table, some toys scattered around, and the occasional piece of evidence that something far more sinister than infant play is happening in there. But one of the most interesting things about Stewie's bedroom is what is concealed within it. There is a weapons locker. This is not something the show ever makes a huge deal of, but it is referenced in several episodes and has been visible in background shots for careful viewers. Stewie's room contains an area that functions essentially as an armory for a baby who should, by any normal logic, be developmentally incapable of assembling the contents. Behind the toys and the stuffed animals and the blocks, there is a Stewie who is systematically building and maintaining a collection of weapons that would be remarkable even for an adult. In Season 6, an episode actually takes the family into Stewie's hidden laboratory for the first time, and the scale of what is revealed there is genuinely startling. What had previously been hinted at in background details across years of episodes is suddenly made explicit. There is a whole hidden section of the Griffin home that has been quietly maintaining itself as Stewie's private domain of invention and menace. The Griffin home also, early in the show's run, had a downstairs bathroom. This bathroom appears in a Season 3 episode and is never seen again in any subsequent episode. The show's normal convention is that all bathrooms are upstairs. Whether this was an inconsistency born from production oversight or a deliberate one-episode gag involving the unexpected existence of a ground-floor bathroom that then got quietly forgotten is not entirely clear, but either way it represents one of many moments where the physical architecture of the house simply does not align with its own precedents. There is also the matter of the fireplace. In a Season 3 Christmas episode, the Griffin living room contains a fireplace that serves as a plot point when an ember escapes and the house catches fire. The interior is destroyed and rebuilt over the course of the episode, but that fireplace does not appear in any other episode before or after. The living room that exists in basically every other scene in the show's history has no fireplace visible in it. This is a continuity detail that has puzzled fans for years, and the most common explanation is that the fireplace was drawn for a specific single-episode purpose and then removed from the standard background plates used for the room because the production team did not want to be committed to maintaining it. This is not unusual in animation, where backgrounds are assets that get reused constantly, and where adding an architectural element means dealing with it in every subsequent scene set in that location. Then there is the attic. The attic of the Griffin house exists primarily as a storage space and is referenced occasionally in episodes, but one detail about it that appears in certain episodes is the existence of something resembling a panic room, a space within the attic where the family can retreat in case of genuine threat. Whether this element was always intended as a recurring feature, or whether it appeared in a few episodes and was then dropped into the same mental filing cabinet as the downstairs bathroom, is somewhat debatable, but it is one of those details that, when you come across it, feels like a glimpse into a version of the show that was slightly more carefully world-built than the version that existed most of the time. The address of the house deserves its own moment. It is 31 Spooner Street. The street name is not a meaningless choice. Quahog, Rhode Island, the fictional town in which the show is set, is built on a geography that borrows heavily from the real Providence, Rhode Island area where Seth MacFarlane studied at the Rhode Island School of Design. McFarlane has spoken about how Providence area geography and landmark names influenced the construction of Quahog's mental map, and several real Rhode Island references are scattered throughout the show's production history. The town's name itself, Quahog, refers to a specific type of hard-shell clam that is native to New England coastal waters and is particularly associated with Rhode Island cuisine. It is an intensely local reference, one that would resonate with anyone who grew up in coastal New England and would be meaningless to most of the rest of the country. This choice says something about McFarlane's intentions. He was making a show about a specific cultural world, not a generic American suburb. He was making it about somewhere he had actually lived and walked around in. The Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends spend so much of their social time, is named in a way that continues this local texture. A clam reference that is simultaneously a pun on being drunk. The bar has its own visual history of background details that long-term viewers will recognize. The neon signs behind the bar change occasionally. The pool table in the back has been there since early in the show's run. There is a regulars corner where Peter, Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland, before his departure to Stoolbend, have their preferred seats. The bartender, who goes largely unnamed in most appearances, is one of those peripheral characters who exists primarily as a background fixture, but who occasionally gets a moment of distinct personality. In Season 3, during an episode involving a local celebrity who becomes relevant to Peter's life, there is a scene at the Drunken Clam in which the bartender's expression changes in the background in a way that suggests he has an opinion about what is being said in the foreground. A small, unremarked-upon piece of character work that went into a background figure because someone in the animation team decided it was worth doing. The town of Quahog itself has a history that was built out across the show's run in ways that feel like a deliberate act of world-building, even when individual episodes were not treating it as a priority. In an early episode, it is established that Peter's ancestor, one Griffin Peterson, founded the town. This is a detail that gets referenced occasionally across the series and has interesting implications for Peter's relationship to the community around him. He is technically descended from the town's founder, which sits in fascinating contrast to the way he is generally perceived and treated by the world around him. The town that bears his family's heritage treats Peter as a buffoon. The man whose ancestor built this place can barely function within it. The James Woods Regional High School, where Meg attends, is one of the show's most persistently entertaining naming gags. The actual James Woods, the actor, appears in the show multiple times as a character, and the school named after him is a detail that sets up multiple layers of absurdity. Why is there a high school named after James Woods in a small fictional Rhode Island town? The show offers various semi-explanations at various points, none of them particularly concerned with coherent logic. The fact that Meg has spent years going to school in a building with his name on it, and that James Woods himself periodically appears in the town and interacts with the people who attend his eponymous institution, is one of those quietly sustained jokes that has a different quality of funny if you think about it for more than 15 seconds. Throughout Quahog, background signs and storefronts contain details that the show's writers use as an ongoing text channel for jokes that the main plot does not have room for. Stores in the background of street scenes carry names that range from slightly weird to genuinely absurd, and the people populating the sidewalks and background of crowd scenes are often doing things that constitute their own small stories, if you pause and look at them. This is particularly true in episodes filmed at the mall, at sporting events, and at public gatherings where the show has to fill large crowd frames with enough visual information to make the setting feel populated and real. The visual language of the show's background art changed significantly across its production history, and some of those changes are more visible in certain episodes than others. The animation of the early seasons, done by studios like Rough Draft, had a looser, more energetic quality that extended to the background details. Elements seemed slightly more handcrafted, slightly more idiosyncratic. As the show moved to cleaner, more digital production processes, the backgrounds became more polished but in certain ways less interesting to study. The early season backgrounds have that quality of appearing to have been drawn by people who were still finding things to put in the corners of frames, experimenting with what worked and what did not. Later backgrounds are more refined and more consistent, but the sense of playful discovery is somewhat reduced. The Griffin family car, the blue van that appears in numerous driving scenes across the early seasons, has a history of being used for background sight gags. In one scene during a driving sequence, The van passes another vehicle whose driver can be seen doing something completely unrelated to the main story, in a way that is visible for only a few frames. Details like this are essentially gifts to the rewatcher. They have no value at normal playback speed for a casual viewer, but they reward the person who has seen the episode before and is looking for what else is happening in the frame. There is also the Griffin's Front Yard, which has hosted a surprising number of plot lines and physical gags over the years. The yard's proximity to the street and to the Swanson house across the road creates a specific kind of setting that the show returns to whenever it needs a relatively neutral outdoor location for a scene. What is interesting about the yard's background details is how much they vary between episodes without any in-world explanation. The state of the garden, the presence or absence of particular lawn ornaments, the height of the grass. These details shift between episodes in ways that suggest the production team was treating the yard as a template that could be customized per episode rather than a fixed location that had to be maintained. This is standard practice in animation, but in Family Guy it sometimes creates an unusually elastic sense of what the physical world outside 31 Spooner Street actually looks like from one week to the next. One background element that appears in certain early episodes and has been noticed by fans doing close frame-by-frame analysis, is a particular piece of artwork in the Griffin hallway. It is a framed piece that appears to depict a rural or coastal scene, and its exact subject and provenance within the show are never specified. But eagle-eyed fans have noted that the artwork changes. Sometimes it appears to be a landscape, sometimes something more abstract, and in at least one episode it is not there at all, replaced by blank wall. Whether this is an inconsistency born of the animators working from different background templates for different episodes, or something more deliberate, is essentially impossible to determine from outside the production process. But it is the kind of detail that the most dedicated Family Guy viewers have cataloged in the spirit of someone trying to understand a house they have lived in for years, but that keeps rearranging its own furniture. Section 3. Peter Griffin's Hidden Layers details hiding inside the franchise's biggest character. Peter Griffin is built from visible things: the belly, the glasses, the chin, the green pants, and the white-collared shirt that he wears in essentially every episode across the show's history, interrupted only by episodes where the plot puts him in a different outfit for a reason. He is one of the most immediately and comprehensively recognizable characters in the history of animation. You could draw two curved lines and a chin, and people would understand what they were looking at. But within all that visual familiarity, there is a level of detail about Peter that most people have never processed, because the most obvious details crowd out the subtler ones. Let us start with the voice, since we have already traced its origin. McFarlane modeled Peter's voice on a security guard at the Rhode Island School of Design, whose particular way of speaking made McFarlane and his friends laugh. What is interesting about this is what it means for Peter's relationship to the real world. This is not an invented accent or a performed comedic voice that emerges from a stock idea of what a working-class Rhode Islander sounds like. It is a specific person's specific vocal quality, reproduced from memory, and then refined through years of performance. There is a human being somewhere in the architecture of that voice, and that humanness, however buried under layers of cartoon exaggeration, is part of why Peter feels, at his best, like a character you could almost know. The green pants. They are almost always there, episode after episode. And there is something quietly systematic about this. Many animated characters are designed with a consistent outfit because consistency is a practical animation requirement. The same character model can be reused across episodes without the production team having to redesign the character's appearance every week. The Simpsons do this. Most long-running animated characters do this. But the specific choice of green for Peter's pants is interesting in that it is not a color that reads as particularly symbolic or deliberate in the way that, say, Stewie's red overalls might be read as a symbolic color choice for a character associated with danger. Peter's green pants are just a slightly unusual choice for a working-class dad, which perhaps says something about the kind of person who designed this family. Someone who made the main character's most ordinary garment, a color that is just slightly off from what you would expect. In the early seasons, there are several background moments involving Peter that reward the careful viewer with information about his interior life that the show never makes explicit in dialogue. In scenes set at the Drunken Clam, when Peter is at the bar with his friends and not the focus of the scene, he is often doing something in the background that constitutes a small, separate joke from whatever the main action is. In certain early episodes, he can be seen in background shots, making faces at himself in the bar mirror, or examining the bottom of his beer glass with an expression of deep scientific interest, or saying something to the bartender that is clearly not getting the response he hoped for. These are the kinds of details that tell you a production team is thinking about what every character is doing in every frame of every scene, not just the character who is currently driving the plot forward. Peter's relationship with television and with the popular culture of the 1970s and 1980s is one of the more textured aspects of his character, and it expresses itself in subtle ways throughout the show's visual design. The titles on the spines of books visible in the Griffin home, in the rare episodes where books appear, are often carefully considered choices that say something about who the Griffins are as a family and what their cultural world looks like. Most of the books visible in the background of the Griffin house are not books that Peter would be reading. They are books that gesture at the kind of aspirational middle-class household the Griffins are trying, imperfectly and often incoherently, to be. There is a layer of cultural pretension in the Griffin home's decorating choices, particularly visible in certain early-season background frames, that sits interestingly alongside Peter's actual intellectual engagement with the world, which is essentially non-existent. The giant chicken fights deserve their own discussion in the context of hidden details, because these recurring sequences contain more carefully planted information than most casual viewers process. The giant chicken, whose name is Ernie, first appears in Season 2's Da Boom episode. The original fight is actually significantly shorter and more contained than the elaborate sequences that would later become a recurring institution of the show. It clocks in at around 1 minute, compared to the multi-minute, globe-spanning, intensely choreographed battle sequences of later seasons. The escalation of the chicken fights over time is itself a hidden joke about the show's own relationship to spectacle and excess. The first chicken fight is a fairly grounded piece of cartoon violence. By the time you reach the later seasons, these sequences have consumed entire episodes and involve levels of collateral damage that would require a federal response in any actual American city. But within the chicken fights themselves, there are details that get planted and then revisited. The fight in Season 4's episode Blind Ambition contains a sequence where Peter and Ernie end up crashing through a movie theater that is showing a specific film if you can read the marquee in the background frames. The film title is a gag that refers to something else happening in the episode's main plot. This kind of visual cross-referencing between the background gag and the main story is characteristic of the show's best moments. The backgrounds are not decoration. They are part of the joke. Peter's job history across the show is also a source of hidden continuity that most viewers have not fully assembled. He begins the show employed at the happy-go-lucky toy factory under a boss named Mr. Weed. In Season 3, in the episode Mr. Saturday Night, Mr. Weed dies during a dinner when he chokes on a dinner roll. This death is treated as genuinely dramatic within the episode, and it results in the toy factory being shut down, leaving Peter out of work. The detail that is easy to miss is that Weed's death is set up in the very same episode with a series of foreshadowing moments, small, odd pieces of business involving Weed at the dinner table that are ambiguous on first viewing, but which become retroactively legible as the build-up to his death once you know it is coming. This is not accidental. The writer who constructed that episode planted those moments, knowing what they would become. After Mr. Weed's death, Peter gets a job at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, which becomes his professional home for most of the rest of the series. The brewery is a reference to actual Rhode Island brewing culture. Narragansett beer is a real Rhode Island lager with deep cultural associations in the state, and the show is clearly drawing on that when it places Peter in the world of Rhode Island craft beer production. Pawtucket itself is a real city in Rhode Island, just south of Providence, and using it as the name of Peter's employer is another one of those small geographic anchors that grounds the fictional world of Quahog in a real place. One of the most interesting hidden aspects of Peter's character is the way his relationship with Brian changes between the early seasons and the later ones, and how that change expresses itself in background behavior before it ever becomes an explicit storyline. In the early seasons, Brian and Peter are genuinely best friends, and their friendship has a quality that you can see in how they behave when they are not the focus of a scene. When Peter is at the center of an interaction and Brian is present in the background, Brian is watching him with an expression that contains genuine affection, The way a person looks at a friend they find both exasperating and deeply dear. In later seasons, when the friendship has become more complicated and Brian's character has drifted significantly from his original personality, those background moments change in ways that are subtle but consistent. Brian in the background of a Peter-centric scene now looks more like a witness than a friend, more like someone observing a car crash from a safe distance than someone watching a person they love make their characteristic mistakes. Peter's physical comedy is itself a source of hidden craft that most viewers do not fully appreciate. The way Peter moves that particular combination of bulk and momentum, the slightly too fast shuffle, the way he stops moving with a heaviness that implies he has been in motion for a second longer than the frame suggests, was developed carefully in the early seasons of the show to create a specific comic rhythm. The animators working on the early seasons, particularly Rough Draft Studios, put visible thought into how Peter's body occupies space and moves through it. There is a specific kind of humor available to a character who is drawn with that mass, and the early animation understood intuitively how to use weight and momentum for comedic effect. The physicality of Peter's gags in the early seasons has a quality that is difficult to precisely articulate, but immediately recognizable. The sense that things that happen to Peter have consequences that feel proportionate to his size, that when he hits a wall or falls down a staircase, the animation communicates something about the relationship between his mass and the world he inhabits. The detail about characters who have been knocked unconscious or killed always being depicted in the same position, one hand on the back, one hand on the ground, lying in a specific arrangement is a production choice that the animation team made early and apparently stuck to throughout the show's run. This was noted in the Crack documentary and confirmed by various production sources. It is genuinely funny once you know to look for it, because it reveals a kind of systematic efficiency in how the animation team handled the problem of depicting unconsciousness. Rather than developing different poses for different situations, they established a house style for the unconscious body and applied it consistently. Characters who get knocked out in wildly different circumstances and wildly different locations always end up in essentially the same arrangement. The universe of Quahog apparently has very specific rules about what the unconscious body defaults to. There is also the matter of what happens in Peter's peripheral vision when the camera is not on him. In crowd scenes set at Griffin home gatherings, at Quahog public events, at church, at Meg's school performances, any scene where Peter is nominally present but the story is not actively requiring his participation, the character can frequently be observed doing something entirely separate from the surrounding action. Checking his phone in scenes set before phones were ubiquitous in the show's world. Having a conversation with another background character that is visually animated but acoustically absent. Eating something that was not on any table when the scene began. Staring in a direction that would suggest he is watching something that is not visible in the frame. These details are not random. They are the production team filling out what Peter's reality looks like when the camera is not centered on him, which is the mark of a production that thinks of its characters as inhabiting a continuous world, rather than simply appearing and disappearing based on plot requirements. Section 4. Brian Griffin's Secret Depths. What the dog was hiding from the very beginning. Brian Griffin is built around a central irony that the show never fully steps back and examines as an irony, but which runs through every scene he is in from the first episode to the most recent. He is a dog who behaves like a person, and the joke that the show extracts from this premise is not primarily about him being a dog. It is primarily about him being a specific kind of person, the kind who is convinced that their intelligence and sensitivity places them in a category above the people around them, while simultaneously doing things that any genuinely intelligent and sensitive person would recognize as deeply embarrassing. But before we get to who Brian became, let us spend some time with who he was in those early episodes, because the early Brian contains details that almost nobody discusses. In the pilot episode and the episodes that follow it closely, Brian's physicality is occasionally that of an actual dog in ways that the later seasons essentially abandon. In certain scenes from the first season, Brian can be briefly seen sitting on all fours, in the posture of a conventional dog rather than the upright, martini-holding, biologically improbable posture that he occupies in virtually every scene across the show's later history. The production team was still finding the line between human and dog in those early episodes, still calibrating how much of Brian's story was dog who has all the qualities of a sophisticated human adult, and how much was dog who occasionally does dog things when it is funny. In the first season, that line was a little more elastic. By the second and third seasons, Brian's default mode had solidified into the fully upright, fully humanized version that would define his presence for the rest of the show. The martini is one of the most carefully deployed character details in Family Guy's history, and its significance is something the show itself acknowledges in a small, quiet way that most viewers miss. Brian drinks dry martinis. He also drinks other things, scotch, wine, bourbon, but the martini is his signature, his recurring prop, the thing that appears most reliably when the visual vocabulary of his character needs to say something quickly about who he is. And the significance of the martini from a characterization standpoint is that it is the driest of cocktails. A martini is defined by its dryness, the absence of sweetness, the minimal dilution, the combination of spirits that are about clean, cold clarity rather than warmth or comfort. Someone at TV Tropes noticed this and articulated it elegantly. Brian's drink-based characterization mirrors his personality. He is dry, he is cold, he has a dry wit and a cynical personality, and he reaches for the driest possible drink. This is not a coincidence. It is characterization embedded in a prop choice. Brian's car, a silver 2004 Toyota Prius, is also a characterization device. The Prius is conspicuously political as an automobile. In 2004, owning a Prius was a statement. It meant you cared about the environment, or at least wanted to be seen as someone who cared about the environment. Brian's Prius is therefore consistent with his liberal politics, his public environmental positions, and his general desire to align his consumption choices with his stated values. What makes this funnier, and what gives the car an additional layer, is the bumper sticker. The license plate reads BRID0G, which is self-explanatory and slightly embarrassing in that way that vanity plates always are. But the bumper sticker says Kucinich 04, a reference to Dennis Kucinich's 2004 Democratic presidential primary campaign, which represented the far-left edge of the party's field that year. Kucinich was the candidate for people who thought John Kerry was not progressive enough. Brian's car identifies him immediately as someone who engages in left-wing politics to an extent that is genuinely impractical, which is exactly who Brian is. All of that is visible every time his car appears in a scene, for anyone who knows what they are looking at. The detail about Brian's middle initial is a small treasure that the show leaves in plain sight. His full name is Brian H. Griffin. The H appears in certain formal contexts within the show when his writing career produces publications that carry his name when he is referred to in official capacities. And according to the DVD commentary for the episode Brian Griffin's House of Pain, the H does not stand for anything. It is specifically designed to stand for nothing. It was added, according to the commentary, as a way to express Brian as pretentious. The use of a middle initial that represents nothing is a characterization choice. It says that Brian is the kind of person who puts a decorative initial on his professional name because he thinks it sounds more substantial and authoritative, more like the serious literary figure he wants to be perceived as. In Heaven, in the episode Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, a future vision shows Brian having died and now spending his afterlife at a table, drinking martinis with Vincent van Gogh, Kurt Cobain, and Ernest Hemingway. The three people Brian is drinking with in heaven are all figures associated with creative genius, intense personal torment, and self-destruction. They are all people who burned brightly and extinguished themselves. Brian, in this brief moment, is placed in their company as though he belongs there, as though he is the fictional equivalent of a tortured artist whose inner life is as rich and painful as theirs. But the punchline is that Brian admits he got there by eating chocolate out of the trash. He did not die heroically or in service of his art. He ate garbage. The entire aspiration toward tragic artistic greatness, placed against the mundane reality of his actual end, is one of the most efficiently constructed characterization gags in the show's history. The detail about Brian attending Brown University is planted early in the show and then expanded. Brown University is a real Ivy League institution in Providence, Rhode Island. The fact that Brian went to Brown aligns with his self-presentation as an intellectual Ivy League attendance is one of the standard markers of the kind of educated person Brian wants to be understood as. But here is the detail that most people know but that contains more implication than most people process. Brian did not graduate. He went to Brown and did not finish his degree. The show acknowledges this and uses it periodically to deflate Brian's intellectual pretensions. He is not a graduate of the Ivy League institution he attended. He is someone who was there and did not complete what he started. This is, in fact, perfectly consistent with everything we know about Brian's relationship to his own ambitions. He gets close to the things he wants to be, close enough to see them clearly, and then fails to actually arrive. Across the early seasons, in scenes set in the Griffin living room where Brian is present but not the primary focus of the action, Brian can occasionally be seen with a book. Not prominently, not in a way that the camera calls attention to. Just a dog, sitting on the couch with a book open on his lap, in the background of a scene that is about something else entirely. This is a detail that confirms, without announcing itself, that Brian actually reads. The later seasons would problematize Brian's relationship to his own intellectual claims. The show would make a fairly explicit argument that Brian is a person who talks about being intellectual without necessarily doing the actual work of sustained intellectual engagement. But in those early episodes, before the writers had discovered what Brian would eventually become and had weaponized his pretensions against him, the background reading is just a quiet, accurate detail about who this character is. Brian's writing desk, visible in certain episodes set in his bedroom or in a home office space, is one of those environments that changes its details between appearances in ways that feel accidental, but occasionally say something. In some episodes, the desk surface is covered with the materials of active creative work draft pages, notes, a typewriter or computer visible in the background. In others, it is bare or cluttered with non-writing detritus. This variability reflects something true about Brian's relationship to his own work. He is intermittently engaged with writing rather than consistently committed to it. The desk that is sometimes covered with drafts and sometimes empty is a small, unconscious reflection of what the show eventually makes explicit about Brian's artistic ambitions. They are real but intermittent, genuine but not quite urgent enough to override everything else. The episode Brian and Stewie from Season 8 is one of the most praised in the show's entire run, and it earns that praise partly through a detail about Brian that is planted and then paid off within a single episode in a way that is devastating if you are paying attention. Brian keeps a gun in a safety deposit box. Stewie discovers this and asks why, and Brian eventually admits, in one of the show's rare moments of genuine emotional rawness, that the gun is there in case he ever wants to end his own life. The reason the gun is in a safety deposit box rather than at home, the reason it is not convenient, not accessible without effort, is that Brian is protecting himself from himself. He knows the impulse exists. He knows it could get the better of him in a moment of weakness. So he put the means of acting on it somewhere that requires deliberate effort to access. That detail, the safety deposit box as a form of protective distance between the impulse and the ability, is one of the most thoughtfully constructed pieces of character writing in the show's history. And it is hidden inside what is nominally an episode about two characters getting locked in a bank vault overnight. Section 5. Stewie's Hidden World, the baby's universe of buried details. Stewie Griffin might be the most densely detailed character Family Guy has ever produced, because the whole premise of the character is that he exists on two levels simultaneously. On the surface, he is a baby, a small, round-headed infant in yellow and red, who sits in high chairs and takes baths, and is subject to all the indignities of being a one-year-old in a family that largely ignores him. Underneath the surface, he is something else entirely. A person of extraordinary intelligence, extraordinary capability, extraordinary ambition, and an extraordinary desire to do violence to his own mother. The humor of Stewie's existence lives entirely in the gap between those two levels, and the show's writers found that gap endlessly generous in the early seasons because it meant that almost anything Stewie did was automatically funny, not because the act itself was inherently comic, but because of who was doing it. Let us begin with Stewie's voice, because everything about Stewie begins with his voice, and it contains a detail that is much more interesting than most people realize. MacFarlane has described Stewie's voice as modeled on Rex Harrison's performance in My Fair Lady, which we have already covered. but there is an additional layer to this that the show itself eventually addresses. In a later episode, it is explicitly revealed that Stewie's British accent is not his natural accent. He is faking it. He chose the accent deliberately because he wanted to sound more sophisticated and to stand apart from the American family he was born into. This revelation, planted in a later episode, retroactively changes every single scene from every earlier episode in which Stewie spoke. Every monologue, every threat, every elaborately constructed plan for world domination, every withering assessment of Peter's failings, all of it was delivered in a voice that Stewie had consciously chosen rather than naturally developed. The performance of sophistication is itself a performance, which is an almost uncomfortably precise thing to know about a baby who has never spent a single moment of his existence being what he appears to be. Stewie's football-shaped head has generated more discussion than almost any other character design choice in Family Guy's history, and within that discussion there are a few details that most people have never fully processed. The head shape was not always there. This sounds impossible given that the football head is so fundamental to Stewie's visual identity that the shape is essentially synonymous with the character. But in a flashback episode, the show depicts Stewie with a normal baby-shaped head and then shows him jumping on his parents' bed with Brian nearby and supposed to be watching him until he hits the ceiling and his head is flattened into the familiar elongated shape. This is depicted as the origin of the football head. However, this contradicts a different flashback episode that shows Stewie being born with his head already in the football shape. The show has two separate, incompatible origin stories for one of its most iconic visual details, and neither one is retconned or resolved. They simply coexist, two different answers to a question the show keeps asking without committing to an answer. The football head shape also carries a detail that the show uses in a relatively late episode, but which has been hiding in the visual record from the beginning. In an episode called Griffin Winter Games, a character named Johnny Weir, the figure skater, playing himself compliments Stewie on his head and notes that it is shaped like a football. Stewie acknowledges this. The entire conversation is a meta-acknowledgement that the football head is visible and notable, that people in the world of the show see it as distinctive, and that Stewie is aware of the way his most prominent physical feature is perceived. But earlier in the show's history, there are many scenes where characters are clearly in close proximity to Stewie and saying nothing about his head because the production team had established a convention where the head was acknowledged only when the story required it and otherwise treated as invisible. The reveal that characters within the world of the show do register and notice the head shape delivered as a late-era joke is retroactively funny when applied to years of episodes where nobody said anything. Stewie's teddy bear, Rupert, is one of the most consistent elements of his life across the entire run of the show, and within the Rupert relationship there are hidden details that communicate something specific about what Rupert means to Stewie. Rupert is not just a toy to Stewie, he is a confidant, an audience, and in the most private moments of Stewie's interior life, something that approaches a companion. In several early episodes, the camera catches Stewie in his room, talking to Rupert in a register that is different from his public voice, less theatrical, more genuinely tender. These are fleeting moments, often happening at the edge of a scene, but they establish something important, that underneath the elaborate performance of evil genius, Stewie has something that functions like genuine emotional attachment, and it is Rupert who holds it. The bear later becomes a plot point in a devastating way when Brian, drunk and out of control, destroys Rupert. This act, the destruction of the one object in Stewie's world that carries genuine emotional weight, is designed to hit harder than most of what happens in the show. It uses information that the early episodes planted carefully in background moments and peripheral scenes. Stewie's weapons are cataloged in the Family Guy wiki with a level of specificity that is genuinely impressive. From the very first episode, when he constructs a mind control device and refers to it matter-of-factly over breakfast, through dozens of subsequent episodes that introduce new inventions, time machines, teleportation devices, cloning equipment, weather control systems, mind alteration tools, a working Star Trek transporter, an assortment of conventional and exotic weapons, Stewie's technological inventory accumulates into a body of work that, if you cataloged it completely, would represent a level of scientific advancement that would be genuinely world-altering in the context of the real world. The joke is that all of this capability sits inside a 1-year-old who is still in diapers, but the detail that makes the joke more interesting is that Stewie's technological achievements are not random or scattershot. They have a coherent internal logic. He is always building towards something. The early Stewie is not just destructively brilliant in the abstract. He has goals, and his inventions are means toward those goals. The block-spelling redrum detail from the episode Love Thy Trophy is probably the most widely discussed Stewie-specific Easter egg in the show's history. In the opening scene, Stewie is playing with building blocks, and if you catch the frame before the camera moves, the blocks spell redrum murder spelled backwards, the iconic message from Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining, where Danny Torrance writes it on walls and doors as a warning about the violence that is coming. The fact that it is specifically Stewie, a character whose defining characteristic across the early seasons is his desire to commit a very specific murder, who is spelling this particular word in his blocks, is exactly the kind of layered gag that rewards the attentive viewer, while remaining invisible to anyone who blinks at the wrong moment. It is a horror movie reference that doubles as character work. Both things are true simultaneously. Stewie's relationship with time travel deserves attention as a source of hidden continuity. The time machine, which first appears in a more primitive form in early seasons, and is eventually refined into the wrist-mounted time travel device that becomes one of the show's most heavily deployed plot mechanisms, creates a unique storytelling situation. Stewie has made many trips through time. Some of them have been explicitly depicted in episodes. Others are implied by details that appear in episodes set in the present, but which contain background objects or references that suggest Stewie has recently returned from somewhere that is not now. The logistics of how much time Stewie has experienced relative to the show's forward timeline are genuinely unknowable, because the time machine visits are not all documented. Stewie may, at any given point in the show's continuity, have already lived through periods of history that the other characters have not yet reached. One of the show's most carefully hidden Stewie details has to do with the nature of the other characters' ability to understand him. The question of who can hear Stewie when he talks is one that the show handles inconsistently and which MacFarlane has addressed in multiple interviews. In a 2011 Comic-Con panel, he compared Stewie's perception by other characters to Wile E. Coyote's physics in old Warner Brothers. Cartoons, the rules exist to serve the comedy, not to create a consistent internal logic. Brian always understands Stewie. Chris sometimes does, more in later seasons than early ones. Peter, Lois, and Meg nominally do not. The show generally plays as though Stewie's sophisticated dialogue is unheard by his family, who perceive him as babbling. But in practice, there are dozens of early season scenes where a character other than Brian clearly reacts to something Stewie has said, even if the scene does not acknowledge this as anything other than background business. The selective hearing of Stewie is less a rule and more a rough convention that the show uses when it serves the joke and ignores when it does not. Section 6. Lois, Meg, and Chris. The overlooked character details. Lois Griffin is one of the most deliberately designed characters in Family Guy's visual vocabulary, and she is also one of the most consistently underanalyzed in discussions of the show's hidden details, which is partly because Lois occupies a narrative role that tends to make her a reactive presence in most episodes rather than an active one. She is the reasonable person in the room, the one who catches what Peter throws, the one who has to hold the household together while also having a history and a personality that are more interesting than most casual viewers fully register. The visual design of Lois is worth examining because it encodes information about her character that is visible but easy to miss. Her red hair is striking in the context of a show that largely populates its world with more muted hair colors, and the choice to give the family's most visually poised and groomed member a vivid, warm hair color while giving the rest of the family flat, unremarkable colors is a design decision that reflects her function within the visual language of the show. Lois is the person who is most distinctively herself, most visually defined, in a household full of characters who are defined primarily by their bodies and their behavior rather than their aesthetic presentation. Lois's voice has its own origin story that is just as specific as any of the others, and it is a detail that Alex Borstein has discussed in interviews. Borstein modeled the voice on a cousin from Great Neck, New York, a Long Island community with a specific cultural and economic identity that Borstein was drawing on when she constructed Lois's particular combination of suburban warmth and slightly exhausted practicality. The Long Island accent, filtered through years of living in Rhode Island, gives Lois a vocal identity that is both geographically specific and culturally textured, and Borstein has described the voice as coming from someone very particular that she knew. The same operation as Peter's voice, essentially a real person's specific way of speaking, absorbed and reproduced and then modified through years of performance into something that feels like it was invented from scratch. In the early seasons, there is a background detail about Lois that is easy to miss because it exists in what she is doing rather than in what is being said about her. Lois plays piano. This is established in the opening sequence where she sits at the piano with Peter, and it is referenced occasionally in episodes where music is part of the story. But in background moments in the early seasons, in scenes where Lois is in the vicinity of the family piano and not the focus of the scene, the character is sometimes shown with her hands positioned in a way that suggests she is actually playing, not just decoratively present near the instrument. This is a small detail that says something about Lois as a person with a skill and with a relationship to that skill that continues to exist even when nobody is paying attention to it. In the later seasons, Lois's piano playing becomes less of a background detail and more of an occasional plot point, which in some ways makes it less interesting as a piece of character writing. Lois's history with her own family, particularly her wealthy and dismissive father Carter Pewterschmidt, contains background details across the show that have been there since early on and which become more legible as the show builds out that family dynamic over many seasons. Carter Pewterschmidt is introduced as a character who has never fully approved of Lois's choice of husband and who maintains a kind of contemptuous relationship with Peter that is thinly disguised as benign patrician tolerance. The background details of the Pewterschmidt estate, visible in episodes set there, contain a wealth of visual information about the kind of family this is: old money, institutional, formal in ways that read as slightly theatrical. Against that background, the existence of Lois's entire personality as a relatively warm and functional adult seems like a small miracle, and the show occasionally acknowledges this when it reveals pieces of the Pewterschmidt family history that clarify why Lois became someone who could exist comfortably in a house like the one on Spooner Street. Meg Griffin's details are of a different character from most of the other Griffin family members, for the simple reason that Meg's most significant details are about absence. The things that are missing from her characterization, the things the show takes away or refuses to give her, are themselves a form of hidden detail for the careful viewer. In the first season, Meg is voiced by Lacey Chabert, who left after one season due to a combination of scheduling conflicts with her role on Party of Five and what MacFarlane has described as a contractual issue with the terms of her original agreement. Mila Kunis took over the role beginning in Season 2, and the voice difference between the two actresses is perceptible if you watch the seasons side by side. Within the show's own world, this voice change is acknowledged in the episode Back to the Pilot, where Stewie, traveling back to the first episode, hears Season 1 Meg and comments on the strangeness of her voice. The show uses its own meta-awareness of the voice replacement as a joke rather than trying to paper over it, which is characteristic of the production's general willingness to acknowledge its own inconsistencies if the acknowledgement can be made funny. Tara Strong, a veteran voice actress with an extraordinarily extensive resume, provides Meg's singing voice in musical episodes. Kunis does not sing as Meg, the character switches voice performers when she begins to sing, a detail that is essentially invisible unless you know to listen for it. The transition between Kunis's speaking voice and Strong's singing voice is handled smoothly enough that most viewers who have never been told this detail simply process it as Meg singing. Chris Griffin's voice origin is one of the most surprising hidden stories in the show's entire history. Seth Green, who voices Chris, was dared by a friend to do his best impression of Ted Levine's character Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs at the audition. The character of Buffalo Bill is a serial killer notable, among other things, for dancing in front of a mirror while wearing a woman's suit of skin. The impression that Seth Green did of this character, tweaked to sound as though it was coming through a school PA system, is the voice that landed him the role of Chris Griffin. The show later paid off this bizarre origin when, in Season 7, Chris performs Buffalo Bill's iconic mirror dance from the film for an extended scene, using the exact character voice. The fact that Chris's voice was born from an imitation of a serial killer, and that this was then made explicit within the show years later, is one of those hidden connections between the production's backstage reality and its on-screen fiction that you simply cannot unsee once someone has pointed it out to you. Section 7. Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland. The side character universe of hidden details. Glenn Quagmire is one of the most carefully designed supporting characters in Family Guy's history, and his design contains several details that express themselves through visual choices rather than dialogue, some of which most fans have never fully processed. The chin. Quagmire's enormous chin is one of those character design choices that is so visually extreme that it crosses from exaggeration into something like caricature, and the show uses this occasionally as a straight sight gag. But the chin also functions as a visual counterpart to his dominant personality trait. Quagmire is a person defined by his appetites, and giving him a jaw and chin of that scale is a way of making his appetites legible on his face. He is literally built for the act of consumption. This is not subtle, but it is consistent. Quagmire's voice was inspired by no specific real-world person that McFarlane has publicly identified, but it has a specific quality that places him immediately within a particular American archetype: the lounge lizard, the pickup artist of the mid-century cocktail bar, the guy who heard Dean Martin records in the early 1960s and decided that was exactly the kind of man he intended to be. The giggity catchphrase that has become so ubiquitous that it has essentially outgrown the character who coined it was, in its earliest appearances, a genuinely carefully deployed joke. In the first seasons, Quagmire did not say it after every slightly suggestive thing that happened in his vicinity. It was used more sparingly, and the sparingness gave it more punch. One of the most interesting hidden details about Quagmire is that he is, by most measures, a significantly more accomplished person than his primary characterization would suggest. He is a commercial airline pilot. He holds a position of real professional responsibility, one that requires extensive training and competence, one that puts him in charge of the safety of everyone aboard his flights. The gulf between Quagmire's professional life and his personal life is enormous and almost never examined by the show directly, but it is there for the viewer to notice. The man who behaves in genuinely problematic ways with everyone around him goes to work every day and safely transports hundreds of people across the country. This is not a detail the show is particularly interested in exploring, but it is real, and it adds a dimension to the character that his surface behavior obscures. Joe Swanson's introduction in Season 1 is worth revisiting in the context of hidden details, because the first episode in which he appears, A Hero Sits Next Door, contains a piece of character establishment that most viewers have processed in one direction, but which works equally well in another. Joe arrives in the neighborhood and immediately commands attention, respect, and admiration. He is in a wheelchair, the result of a confrontation with the Unabomber on Christmas Eve, as he eventually explains, but the wheelchair does not define how people perceive him in this first episode. What defines him is competence, confidence, and a kind of active energy that makes everyone in his vicinity feel slightly less interesting by comparison. Peter is jealous of Joe in this episode specifically because Joe is so obviously admirable, so clearly someone that the neighborhood looks up to, that Peter's own deficiencies feel magnified in his presence. The interesting hidden detail here is what this introduction tells us retroactively about what happens to Joe over the following seasons. The character who enters the show as the most admired person in the neighborhood eventually becomes someone who is primarily mocked, whose disability becomes a recurring source of jokes rather than a fact about someone's life that the show treats with some dignity, whose marriage deteriorates, whose professional accomplishments become invisible. The gap between the Joe of A Hero Sits Next Door and the Joe of later seasons is enormous, and it is most visible when you watch the introduction episode after years of seeing what Joe eventually became. The first episode is essentially a portrait of who Joe is at his best, which makes everything that happens to the character afterwards something you can measure against a baseline. Cleveland Brown's departure from Family Guy for his own spin-off series in 2009 was accompanied by a backstory detail that had been building in the show for years before the spin-off actually happened. Cleveland's divorce from Loretta, his marriage to Donna, his relationship to his existing family situation, and his new one, these are elements that the Family Guy writers were developing in Cleveland's characterization before the Cleveland show was greenlit, and some of them were being seeded in background moments and throwaway lines that, in retrospect, read as early drafts of what would become the spin-off's premise. Whether this was deliberate foreshadowing or simply the natural direction of a character who had been given enough personality to generate his own trajectory is not entirely clear, but the show's careful establishment of Cleveland's emotional situation in the seasons leading up to his departure gives the transition more texture than it would otherwise have. The evil monkey who lives in Chris's closet is one of the most entertaining recurring background details in the show's early history. The evil monkey appears in the background of Chris's bedroom scenes, always pointing menacingly, always treated by Chris as a source of genuine fear. For years, this was simply a running gag, a deranged monkey who lives in Chris's closet and points at him, for no reason that the show was particularly interested in explaining. The revelation, delivered in a later episode, that the evil monkey is not actually evil, that he is a monkey who is going through a difficult personal situation, who is pointing at Chris not out of menace but out of his own emotional distress, is the kind of long-game recontextualization of a running gag that the show does brilliantly when it chooses to. Every previous Chris bedroom scene, viewed with this knowledge, becomes quietly funnier because the pointing menace in the corner was actually just a monkey who needed someone to talk to. Section 8. The Cutaway Universe's Hidden Logic. What lives inside the show's most famous trick? The cutaway gag is the most visible, most discussed, most imitated structural feature of Family Guy, and it is also the feature that contains the most hidden information if you approach it as something other than a random joke delivery system. The show's relationship to its own cutaway format is more complicated and more self-aware than it is usually given credit for, and within that format there are recurring details, visual callbacks, and deliberate connections to the surrounding story that most viewers never notice because the nature of the cutaway format actively discourages careful attention. The gags are designed to be fast. They are designed to arrive and depart. But if you stop them and look, many of them have more going on than their surfaces suggest. To understand why the cutaway format developed the way it did, it helps to know something about how the show came to exist in its original conception. Family Guy was designed for a specific comedic mission that Seth MacFarlane described in early interviews as wanting to pack more jokes into an episode than any other show was doing at the time. The Simpsons, at its peak, was doing approximately 4 jokes per minute. MacFarlane wanted to beat that number by using the cutaway as a device for inserting additional joke content that did not require the main narrative to pause or change direction. In the original design of the format, the cutaway was a bonus. It was content that sat on top of the story rather than inside it, which meant you could add cutaways to an episode without losing any of the primary plot material. This is why, in the early seasons, removing every cutaway from an episode still leaves you with a complete story. The plot of a Season 1 or Season 2 episode exists independently of the cutaways that decorate it. This is not true of later seasons, where the main narrative has in many cases become a structural skeleton for hanging cutaways from, rather than a story in its own right. But within those early cutaways, there are details. Many of the most memorable early cutaway gags are not random. They are built around a visual language that connects to something in the main story, even when the connection is not explicit. A character makes a comparison, "This reminds me of," and the cutaway that follows is chosen specifically because it mirrors or exaggerates some quality of the situation being compared. The comparison does not just exist as a setup, it is doing tonal work. It is saying something about how the character relates to what is happening to them by choosing the specific comparison they choose. In the first few seasons, many of the cutaways are historical or cultural in their reference points, in a way that reflects MacFarlane's personal sensibilities. He is drawn to mid-century American culture, to the aesthetics of the 1950s and 1960s, to a particular kind of big band, cocktail hour Americanism that was already being nostalgically mined by the time Family Guy premiered. These references appear in cutaways that many younger viewers simply do not have enough cultural context to place, which means the jokes land differently depending on the age and cultural background of the person watching. This is a form of hidden content, the jokes that are completely visible on the screen but invisible to the person who lacks the reference frame to decode them. The most technically interesting structural feature of the cutaway format is something that the show actually made explicit in the episode Back to the Pilot, where Brian and Stewie time travel to the first episode and observe the pilot's characters standing around in silence during a cutaway, with nothing to do until the show returns to them. The joke is that the characters in the main story have been paused while the cutaway plays out. They have no awareness of the cutaway and no continuity across it. They are simply suspended, waiting. This is a comedic articulation of the actual mechanical reality of how cutaways work in the show's fiction. The main story genuinely does stop while the cutaway runs, and then resumes as though no time has passed. The Conway-Twitty cutaways, which became a recurring element of the show across several seasons, are worth examining as a specific case study in how the cutaway format relates to its own conventions. For viewers who encountered these for the first time, the Conway-Twitty sequences in which the show cuts to full, unedited performances of country music songs by the late Conway-Twitty, rather than an actual joke, are initially disorienting in a way that could read as either very funny or very strange, depending on your tolerance for absurdism. The first time it appears, the non-jokeness of the Conway-Twitty cutaway is itself the joke. It is a gag that lands entirely because it fails to meet the expectation that a cutaway should contain a punchline. The second time it appears, the joke is about the show having the audacity to do it again. By the third and fourth appearances, the joke has essentially exhausted itself, and the Conway-Twitty cutaway becomes something that longtime viewers of the show point to as the most efficient example of the format's capacity for self-indulgence. But within the Conway-Twitty gags, there are small details in the staging and presentation that reward close attention. The way the performances are framed, the specific songs that are used, and their sometimes oblique connection to the episodes they interrupt, the reactions or non-reactions of the characters who are nominally present during the performance, these are all places where the show is making specific choices rather than simply playing extended country music for its own sake. The Conway-Twitty sequences are not entirely random, even when they appear to be. There is a logic to which episodes they appear in and which songs are used. A logic that is not always visible on the surface, but which becomes clearer when you look at the broader context of the episodes they interrupt. One of the most persistently interesting sets of hidden details across the show's cutaway archive has to do with the show's relationship to its own canceled and revived status. In several cutaways across the revival era, Season 4 and onward, there are jokes that only fully land if you understand the show's history of cancellation and return. References to coming back from the dead, to being given a second chance, to escaping a situation that seemed terminal, appear in cutaways that seem on the surface to be about something else entirely. The show is talking about itself in the language of its own jokes, creating a layer of meaning that exists for the viewer who knows the production history and is invisible to the viewer who does not. The episode Cutaway Land, in which Peter and Lois gain the ability to travel between cutaways, is the show's most extended meditation on its own structural identity. The conceit of the episode that the cutaway world is a physical place that characters can visit is amusing as a premise, but the execution reveals something interesting. When the show uses recycled cutaways from earlier seasons within this episode, it creates an accidental archive. Cutaway Land inadvertently documents which gags from the show's history the production team considered iconic enough to revisit, which is itself a form of hidden list of the show's greatest hits as the writers saw them. Whether or not you agree with their selections, the list exists, embedded in the episode. Section 9. Hidden References, Parodies, and Pop Culture Layers. Family Guy's relationship to pop culture has always been more systematic than it appears. The show does not make references randomly. It makes them in accordance with a specific set of aesthetic loyalties and personal interests that trace almost directly back to Seth MacFarlane's biography and creative tastes, and understanding those loyalties allows you to read the reference map of the show in a way that reveals patterns invisible to the casual viewer. MacFarlane has been openly and consistently a fan of classic Hollywood cinema, mid-century American music, and particularly of the big band jazz era. He is a legitimate singer in that tradition. He has released multiple albums of standards and has performed at venues that take that genre seriously. This is not a pose or a character affinity. It is his actual musical world. And it expresses itself continuously throughout Family Guy in ways that range from the obvious to the deeply buried. The opening theme song is one of the show's most visible pieces of pop cultural ancestry. The melodic structure of the Family Guy theme bears more than a passing resemblance to the kind of mid-century television theme that MacFarlane grew up with: broad, optimistic, slightly theatrical, designed to set a tone of cheerful suburban normalcy. Its relationship to the All in the Family theme has already been established, but the technical musical choices in the Family Guy arrangement also reflect McFarlane's personal compositional sensibilities, including a harmonic language that is slightly more sophisticated than a basic sitcom theme needs to be. The chord voicings and the orchestral texture of the theme are those of someone who has actually thought about music theory, not just of someone who wanted a catchy signature. The Blue Harvest episode, the show's first Star Wars tribute special, is perhaps the most reference-dense single episode in the show's entire catalog. But within the reference density, there are specific details that most viewers have noticed, and others that almost nobody catches. The broader reference, Family Guy is doing Star Wars and reimagining its characters as the Griffin family, is immediately legible to any viewer. But within the episode, there are background cameos of animated characters from other shows who should not be in this universe at all. In the cantina scene at the far left of the frame, visible for just a second or two before the camera moves, Roger from American Dad can be seen talking to someone. And if you look closely at the background of the same scene, Bender from Futurama is also present. And in a corner, Coach John McGuirk from Home Movies, a show that had no business being anywhere near a Family Guy Star Wars special, can be spotted. These are gifts to the viewer who pauses and looks, placed by animators who clearly had opinions about how much fun they could sneak into a background frame. The show's relationship to The Simpsons deserves its own examination as a source of hidden references. The shows have been in a kind of creative conversation with each other since Family Guy first premiered, partly because they share a network and a Sunday night time block, and partly because the cultural comparison between them is so obvious and so endlessly discussed that ignoring it would itself be a statement. The Family Guy writers have inserted Simpsons references into backgrounds, dialogue, and visual design across the entire run of the show, and the direction of the joke changes depending on the era. In early seasons, The Simpsons references tend to be affectionate or at least respectful. McFarlane has credited The Simpsons as an influence and has been relatively restrained about comparing the two shows unfavorably to each other in direct terms. In later seasons, as Family Guy's own confidence grew and its relationship to its own cultural status became more complicated, The Simpsons references become more pointed. The Simpsons crossover episode in Season 13 is particularly interesting as a cache of hidden details. In the crossover, Homer and Peter meet and eventually fight, and the fight sequence is structured as a callback to Peter's fights with the giant chicken, a formal choice that says something about how Family Guy categorizes its own recurring gags. Homer's weapon during the fight is a series of Emmy Awards trophies that Peter cannot retaliate with because Family Guy, unlike The Simpsons, has not won the Outstanding Comedy Series Emmy. This is a self-deprecating joke about the show's comparative award histories that is hidden inside a physical fight sequence. You have to know the award's history to decode it. Roger from American Dad also appears briefly in the crossover episode and then exits very quickly, which the show frames as a reference to American Dad no longer being on Fox. The Wilhelm scream is one of those hidden audio details that appears in Family Guy multiple times, and which constitutes a genuine piece of cinematic archaeology if you know what you are listening for. The Wilhelm scream is a specific sound effect, a distinctive male scream recorded in 1951 for a Western film that has been used in hundreds of films and television shows as a kind of inside joke shared by sound editors across the industry. It has appeared in Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Lord of the Rings, and dozens of other major productions, always briefly and always requiring a specific kind of attentiveness to catch. Family Guy uses it deliberately, as a knowing nod to this history, and it appears in multiple episodes in contexts where the scream is technically plausible, but also specifically chosen for the recognition it offers to the viewer who has been trained to hear it. The Luke Perry TV Guide reference is one of those details that works on multiple levels simultaneously and reveals something about the show's relationship to its own meta-awareness in a way that is easy to miss. In an episode where Peter needs to find a news story for Meg's school newspaper, he is flipping through a TV guide that has Luke Perry on the cover. If you pause to read the small text beneath Perry's picture, it says, "If you can read this, Family Guy is on the air." It is a message addressed directly to the careful viewer, acknowledging that the show is aware of the people who pause and read the background text, and then using that awareness to make a small joke about its own survival. Given that Family Guy was canceled and revived, and was at various points genuinely uncertain about its continued existence, the phrase Family Guy is on the air reads as more than a casual self-reference. It is a small expression of relief. The Gumball 2 Gumball reference, scattered across the show in background television appearances and passing mentions, is one of McFarlane's most personal hidden details. Gumball 2. Gumball was the name of the first television show he pitched to Fox, a different project entirely, pitched before Family Guy was developed, that Fox rejected. McFarlane has incorporated the name of his failed pitch into Family Guy as a recurring background gag, a small private memorial to the project that did not make it. Every time Gumball 2 Gumball appears in the background of a television screen in a Family Guy episode, it is Seth MacFarlane acknowledging his own rejection history and then gently pointing at it and laughing. The show's self-aware references to its production team are scattered throughout the show in ways that most viewers never connect to their sources. The character Neil Goldman, Meg's persistent and unrequited admirer at James Woods Regional High School, shares his name with a real writer who worked on Family Guy's production team. The guest character at Meg's slumber party in the episode 15 Minutes of Shame, a girl with short blonde hair and a blue hair clip, is the animated version of writer Steve Callahan's daughter, drawn into the background of an episode as a private tribute. The character Cherry Sheva Pravadumrong, visible briefly in a season 11 episode, is a reference to a real Family Guy producer of the same name. These are production team members inserting small, personal cameos into the background of a show that will be seen by millions of people, none of whom will ever know who these individuals are. Section 10. Production Secrets and Animator Easter Eggs. Every long-running animated series accumulates a set of production legends, stories about how things got made, what got slipped past the network censors, what animators hid in frames that were on screen for less than a second, what the voice actors did in the recording booth that never made it to broadcast. Family Guy has more of these stories than most shows of its era, and some of the best ones have never been widely discussed. The production timeline for a Family Guy episode is, by the standards of network animation, relatively extended. In 2009, McFarlane estimated the cost of producing one episode at approximately $2 million. The production process includes the full animation pipeline: writing, storyboarding, voice recording, layout, animation, post-production, and from script approval to broadcast takes substantially longer than a casual viewer would guess. The voice actors typically record their lines early in the process, before animation begins, which means the animators are working from completed audio to time their visual performances. This has an interesting implication for how the show's comedic timing is constructed. The visual comedy is synchronized to voice performances rather than the other way around, which means the animators are interpreting performances that have already been fixed and finding the visual language to match them. Seth MacFarlane's own vocal performance across his four major characters in the show, Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, is a production feat that often gets under-discussed because it is so familiar that it stops being remarkable. In a single recording session, McFarlane might be required to voice all four of these characters in scenes where they interact with each other, performing each voice in sequence and trusting the editing process to assemble them into conversation. The physical and technical demands of this are considerable. Stewie's voice in particular is vocally taxing, requiring McFarlane to hold an accent and a vocal register that is significantly different from his natural speaking voice for extended periods. McFarlane has spoken about the toll this takes on his voice and has described how he protects his vocal health around recording sessions. There is also the matter of the two versions of almost every Family Guy episode. Because Fox is a broadcast network with FCC content standards, and because Family Guy is a show that regularly operates at the edge of what is acceptable for primetime broadcast, there has always been a gap between the version that airs on Sunday night and the version that the production team considered the complete episode. The broadcast version is edited for content, language is cleaned up, certain scenes are trimmed or removed, visual gags that would not pass broadcast standards are cut. The DVD and streaming versions of episodes include this material, meaning that anyone who has only seen Family Guy through its original broadcast has seen a censored version of every episode. The complete episode, as the writers and McFarlane intended it, has never been broadcast. The episode Partial Terms of Endearment is the most famous case of an episode that never aired at all on American broadcast television. The episode, produced in season 8, involves Lois becoming a surrogate mother for a friend and then dealing with complications when the friend dies. Fox deemed the episode too controversial for broadcast due to its subject matter and refused to air it entirely, a decision that MacFarlane publicly addressed at San Diego Comic-Con in 2009. The episode was eventually released on DVD and was aired by the BBC in the United Kingdom, but it has never been broadcast in the United States. An episode of Family Guy that most American Family Guy fans have never seen. The original pitch pilot, which MacFarlane produced before the show was greenlit, differs in several interesting ways from the first broadcast episode. This 15-minute pilot has been preserved and has been described in various accounts and analyzed by fans who have gained access to it. Some details and scenes from the pitch pilot made it into the broadcast episode. Others were dropped or significantly altered. The Shoulder Angel, Shoulder Devil scene made the transition. Certain character dynamics that were established in the pitch but would have been inconsistent with the show's final characterization were quietly adjusted. The pitch pilot is essentially a preview of a slightly different version of Family Guy, one where some of the same jokes exist, but some of the characters' baseline relationships are slightly different. The animator's habit of placing the unconscious or dead character in a specific default pose, one hand on back, one hand on the ground, has already been mentioned, but it is worth noting that this detail was apparently not a formal directive from the production, but rather a convention that developed organically within the animation team and then became established practice. This is the kind of detail that reveals how animation studios develop their own visual vernaculars over time through individual choices made by individual artists that then become house style. There is also the detail about Brian's license plate reading BRID0G, a vanity plate that uses a 0 in place of the letter O, a style choice associated with a specific era of personalized license plate culture that perfectly fits Brian's particular brand of trying to be cool and slightly missing. The Kucinich 04 bumper sticker on the same car is a detail that dates the car within the show's timeline. Dennis Kucinich ran for the Democratic presidential nomination in 2004, which places the bumper sticker as a relic of that specific political moment. Brian's car is a period piece even within the show's elastic timeline. One production detail that affects essentially every episode of the show but is essentially never discussed is the role of composer Walter Murphy in creating the show's musical identity. Murphy composed original music for Family Guy across many seasons, and the music is significantly more sophisticated from a compositional standpoint than most people consciously register when watching. The show's musical cues are often doing tonal work that the visual storytelling leans on, heavily establishing mood, signaling comedic or dramatic shifts, providing the emotional scaffolding for scenes that would land differently without the specific musical choices underneath them. In the episode Brian Does Hollywood, the joke about John Williams potentially scoring an adult film is a celebration of Murphy's position within the show's sonic identity. The nominees listed alongside Williams include Ron Jones and Walter Murphy, real members of the Family Guy music team, placed in an absurd context specifically to make the point that Family Guy takes its music seriously. The show's sound design is another under-discussed production element that contains hidden details for the attentive listener. The Wilhelm scream has already been mentioned. But beyond that specific Easter egg, Family Guy's sound designers use recurring audio signatures across the show's run that function as an oral continuity, certain background crowd noises, certain ambient soundscapes for specific locations, certain signature sound effects that become associated with specific characters or recurring situations. The Drunken Clam has a specific acoustic signature. The Griffin living room has one. The school hallways have one. These are not random. They are choices made by sound designers who were thinking about how to give each recurring location its own distinct sonic identity. Section 11. Cross-episode continuity and the show's hidden story threads. Family Guy has a reputation for continuity indifference, for being a show that exists in a floating present in which events are frequently undone. Characters maintain constant ages despite time passing, and the world resets after each episode to roughly the state it was in before the episode began. This reputation is not entirely undeserved. The show does not maintain continuity in the way that serialized drama does. But within that general indifference to continuity, there are threads that run across many episodes and many seasons, planted details that reward the viewer who has been paying attention for a long time. The most sustained piece of cross-episode continuity in the show's entire history is Bonnie Swanson's pregnancy. Bonnie, the wife of Joe Swanson, was pregnant for approximately 116 episodes. That is across 7 seasons of television. She was pregnant at the beginning of season 2 and did not give birth until season 7. The in-world explanation for this extended gestation was never seriously offered. The show simply had Bonnie continue to be pregnant for years, occasionally acknowledging the duration of the pregnancy as an absurdist fact about the world the show occupied. This is not a continuity error. It is a sustained, deliberately maintained detail that constitutes one of the longest-running background gags in the show's history. The giant chicken's continuity across the show is another sustained thread that most viewers have not fully assembled. Ernie the giant chicken, first introduced in Da Boom in season 2, has appeared in numerous episodes across the show's entire run. But the episodes in which he appears are not merely repeats of the same gag, they build on each other in specific ways. The level of violence and property destruction escalates with each subsequent fight. The personal history between Peter and Ernie, originally sparked by a dispute over an expired coupon, is occasionally fleshed out in small ways across different appearances. In some episodes, brief glimpses of Ernie's domestic life are visible in background frames. He has a wife, he has a home, he has a life that exists when he is not fighting Peter Griffin. The show invests him with enough off-screen presence to give the fights a quality beyond mere spectacle. The fate of Meg's social life across the show contains a hidden continuity thread that is never explicitly acknowledged but is visible if you watch carefully. In the early seasons, Meg has a small, loose social circle. Not popular, but not entirely without peers. Over time, across many seasons, that social circle contracts. By the middle seasons of the show, Meg is essentially socially isolated at school. This contraction was not planned as a formal arc, but it tracks with the progressive worsening of the show's treatment of Meg as a character. As the writers committed more deeply to Meg's suffering as a source of comedy, the background social world that had been built around her in earlier episodes quietly dissolved. Brian's relationship to his son Dylan is a piece of continuity that gets introduced and then dropped and then occasionally revisited, never quite resolved into a complete story, but never entirely forgotten either. Dylan was established as Brian's biological son from a previous relationship, conceived before the show began, and introduced in an episode that gave Brian a moment of genuine parental engagement. The subsequent treatment of this relationship, or more accurately, the subsequent non-treatment of it, is itself a piece of hidden information. Every season that passes without Dylan being mentioned is a season in which Brian has essentially abandoned his son, consistent with what Quagmire eventually articulates in his famous speech about Brian's failings. The backstory of Lois's family, particularly the details of the Pewterschmidt fortune and its origins, is built out across many seasons in ways that add layers of meaning to the family dynamic without any single episode making a big production of it. Carter Pewterschmidt's wealth is established as old money in the early seasons, generational, institutional, the kind of wealth that does not need to announce itself because it has always been present. Over time, specific details about how the Pewterschmidt fortune was built are revealed in various episodes, and some of these details are not flattering. The history of the family's money contains elements that complicate the surface respectability of the Pewterschmidts considerably. The show's relationship to continuity regarding Stewie's age is handled with a kind of cheerful disregard that is itself a form of detail for the careful viewer. Stewie is explicitly established as 1-year-old and remains 1-year-old for essentially the show's entire run, including through periods that represent years of in-show time. However, certain episodes do depict time passing in ways that should affect Stewie's age. Season 18 contains a moment where it can be established that Stewie has been 1 year old for a period that would, by any normal accounting, make him significantly older. The show acknowledges this paradox occasionally as a meta-joke, with characters commenting on the fact that Stewie has been a baby for an implausibly long time. The question of whether the Griffin family actually loves each other is one that gets answered differently by different episodes, and the pattern of those answers across the show's history contains a hidden arc of sorts. In the early seasons, the answer is clearly yes, dysfunctionally, imperfectly, but genuinely. In the middle seasons, the answer becomes more ambiguous and harder to read. In certain later season episodes, the answer is almost definitively no. The family behaves toward each other with a contempt that goes beyond dysfunction into something more troubling. But interspersed even in the late seasons are episodes that restore the warmth, that give specific pairs of characters moments of genuine connection, that confirm the show's muscle memory of caring about these people even in the eras when it appears to have forgotten how to care about them. These warmth episodes, scattered through the more difficult stretches, are themselves a form of continuity evidence that the capacity was always there, even when it was not being used. Section 12. The deepest cuts, the rarest hidden details most fans never found. We have been at this for a while now, and if you are still with me, you are exactly the kind of viewer that this section is made for. Because now we are going into the territory that requires not just attentiveness, but a specific kind of patience, the ability to slow down further than normal, to sit with a single frame for longer than the show's pacing intends, to look at the corners of images that the camera never lingers on. These are the details that even lifelong Family Guy fans have largely missed. In the episode Model Misbehavior, the Griffin family wins a boat race, and their victory makes the newspaper. Lois holds up a copy of the paper to show that the family is featured in it. If you pause the episode at this moment and read the lower portion of the newspaper page, beneath the story about the boat race, there is a second headline that reads, DVDS paused for headline joke millions disappointed. The joke exists only for the person who pauses the episode to read the headlines. It is a gag that has been left inside a frame that was never meant to be frozen, waiting for the viewer who would go looking. The headline anticipates its own discovery. It knows you are going to pause to look at it, and it is already laughing at you for doing so when you get there. In an episode where Peter is depicted in a Tron-style racing sequence, there is a wall in the background as he accelerates that contains text written upside down. The text reads, "If you can read this, your TV is upside down." This requires you to not only pause the episode, but to invert your reading of the background image, to rotate your perspective to decode a message that was placed specifically where it would require physical effort on the part of the viewer to access. The message is not connected to anything else in the episode. It is purely a gift to the person who inverts their viewing angle and goes looking. The Obey Giant reference hidden in the Cleveland Loretta episode is one that requires cultural knowledge outside the show itself to decode. In a scene where Peter is repainting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, there is a background element that depicts the iconic Obey Giant image, the stylized face associated with artist Shepard Fairey and his Obey propaganda art project, which has appeared on street art, posters, and public walls across the world since the late 1980s. The reason this image appears in this specific context is that Seth MacFarlane and Shepard Fairey both attended the Rhode Island School of Design. The Obey Giant reference is a nod from one RISD alumnus to another, buried inside a cutaway gag about Michelangelo's most famous ceiling. In the Star Wars Blue Harvest episode, just after the classic Star Wars opening crawl, and as the camera pans across the starfield toward the opening ship sequence, several faces can be seen formed in the star patterns, specific constellations that resolve into recognizable images if you look at them carefully. This is the animators doing the equivalent of drawing faces in the clouds, hiding visual jokes inside what should be pure ambient background. The fact that the star patterns require scrutiny to resolve into faces means that most viewers have seen this sequence dozens of times without ever noticing what is there. The 99 red balloons reference in the Mort Goldman time travel episode is the kind of hidden detail that combines cultural reference with careful prop placement in a way that is extremely specific. Mort ends up in Nazi Germany during World War II. There is a group of German scientists working on a project involving inflated balloons, 100 of them. The episode pays off this detail when one balloon pops, leaving 99. This is a reference to the 1983 German protest song 99 Luftballons by Nina, which translates literally to 99 red balloons and is a Cold War anti-war anthem about an accidental military escalation triggered by a cluster of balloons drifting into restricted airspace. The show is hiding an anti-war German pop song inside a joke about time travel to World War II in a way that requires the viewer to both know the song and recognize that Luftballons is German for balloons to fully decode. The reference. In the episode where Jesus makes an appearance and drives a car, His license plate reads WWID. This is a parody of the WWJD bracelets and bumper stickers that were popular evangelical Christian merchandise in the late 1990s and early 2000s, standing for What Would Jesus Do? The plates on Jesus's car say, What would I do? The logical extension of WWJD applied to the person WWJD is about. The joke is there on the license plate, requiring only that you read it. But reading license plates on fictional cars in background frames of animated television shows requires a specific kind of engagement that most viewers never develop. The Neil Goldman character, Meg's persistent admirer throughout the school years, is named after a real person. Neil Goldman was a writer on Family Guy's production staff. The character shares his name with the crew member as a private tribute that functions both as an Easter egg for anyone who reads the show's credits carefully and as an ongoing private joke for the actual Neil Goldman, who got to watch a semi-regular character on the show he worked on carry his name. This kind of crew tribute is common enough in television that it has its own informal tradition, but the specificity of this particular case, the character is not a hero or a cool background figure. He is an awkward and unrequited pursuer of a girl who does not return his interest, gives the tribute its own quiet, comedic texture. In an episode involving a news studio, in the background of a scene where Meg and Neil are junior newscasters, James Woods appears in the background dressed as Peter Griffin and being followed by a camera crew. This requires a very specific set of conditions to notice. You have to be watching the background of a scene rather than the foreground. You have to be familiar enough with James Woods' appearance to recognize him in a brief background cameo, and you have to understand the reference to the James Woods running joke that the show had been developing across several episodes. James Woods in a Peter Griffin costume in a background frame is the kind of detail that the production team put there specifically because they knew most viewers would never find it, and that the ones who did would feel like they had discovered something genuinely extraordinary. Brian's bumper sticker history on his Toyota Prius is a detail that extends further than most people realize. The Kucinich 04 sticker is the most famous, but the car accumulates other small visual details across its appearances in the show that track Brian's political and personal evolution in ways that are never explicitly addressed in dialogue. This is the kind of detail that requires watching every episode in which Brian's car appears and comparing what you see on the car's exterior across those appearances, which is a level of dedicated cross-reference viewing that essentially nobody does in the course of normal viewing, but which reveals something interesting about how thoroughly the production team was thinking about Brian's characterization even in incidental visual details. The fake production codes that occasionally appear in episodes in background contexts, on clipboards, on documents visible in office scenes, in credits adjacent material, are another layer of detail that rewards the viewer who reads what is written in the margins of the show's visual world. Production codes in television serve as internal organizational identifiers for episodes, and Family Guy's production codes follow a specific convention. In certain episodes, when documents related to the show's production are briefly visible in the background, the codes visible on them sometimes correspond to real episode production codes in ways that constitute another layer of self-reference, the show citing its own production paperwork within its own visual world. The show's fake television stations and news programs carry names that contain their own hidden jokes. Quahog 5 News, the fictional local news operation anchored by Tom Tucker, has a station identifier that reads as a specific kind of local news in-joke. The format and visual design of fictional Quahog news programs across the show's run is a studied parody of regional American news broadcasting, and within that parody there are specific visual details, graphics packages, ticker text, crawl information during broadcasts that contain gags for the viewer, who freezes the frame and reads what is there. One of the most quietly sustained hidden details in the show's visual history is what appears in the background of Stewie's room on the occasions when the camera gives a wide shot of the space. Beyond the obvious weaponry and the obvious toys, beyond the things the show clearly wants you to notice, there are items in the far corners and on the high shelves that constitute a private museum of Stewie's interests and preoccupations. Books with titles that contain jokes, blueprints for devices that have not appeared in any episode but that suggest ongoing projects, small figurines and models that reference things outside the show. This is the work of background artists who were given free rein to populate a space with their own ideas about who Stewie is when nobody is watching, and the result is a bedroom that, in its most detailed versions, contains more character information than several episodes of dialogue. The show's treatment of background extras, the unnamed characters who populate crowd scenes, walk past in street scenes, sit at nearby tables in restaurant scenes, deserves a specific mention because this is where some of the show's most genuinely free humor lives. Background extras in Family Guy are not blank. They are doing things. They have small stories. In a crowd scene at one of Peter's public escapades, if you scan the faces and positions of the background characters rather than watching Peter, you will find a collection of miniature dramas and comedic moments that exist completely independently of the main action. Someone is losing their wallet. Someone else is having an argument that is clearly not about what they appear to be arguing about. A couple is breaking up in a way that suggests this has been a long time coming. None of this is scripted. It is the work of animators who brought their own imagination to the task of filling the spaces that the story leaves empty. The fact that every episode contains at least one instance of a character saying, "What the hell?" is a detail that sounds too simple to be interesting until you think about what it means for the production process. Someone at some point established a house rule either explicitly or through accumulated convention that this phrase had to appear in every episode. It is a shared vocabulary item that crosses every character voice, every situation, every type of scene. Peter says it, Lois says it, Brian says it, Quagmire says it. It appears in dramatic scenes and comedic ones, in cutaways and in main story moments. It is the most democratic phrase in the show's entire lexicon, and its systematic presence across every episode is itself a kind of hidden signature, a mark that Family Guy makes on every episode, a recurring fingerprint that says this show was here and it was surprised by what it found. There are specific details about how the show handles death, both character deaths and incidental background deaths, that constitute their own layer of hidden information. The show has a specific set of conventions about what dying characters do and say, conventions that were established in the early seasons and that persist even when the show is most inconsistent in other ways. In episodes that involve significant plot deaths, there is a pacing pattern that the writers have used consistently. A moment of action that causes the death, a beat of silence that lasts slightly longer than seems comfortable, and then a tonal shift that either plays the death for dark comedy or for genuine emotion, depending on the register the episode has established. This structure is the same whether the show is killing a minor character for a throwaway gag or doing something as significant as the Brian death arc. It is a production-level convention that tells you something about how the show understands death as a dramatic tool. And then there is the detail that might be the most poignant of all the hidden things in this show, something that requires knowing the real world for it to have its full weight. Seth MacFarlane was scheduled to be on American Airlines Flight 11 on the 11th of September 2001. He missed the flight by 10 minutes because of a combination of being hungover from the previous night and a miscommunication with his travel agency about the departure time. Flight 11 was one of the aircraft hijacked that morning. MacFarlane has spoken about this experience carefully and without melodrama in various interviews, noting that he has always thought of his survival as something beyond his control fate in operation, for whatever that is worth. Within Family Guy, in the episodes produced after this event, there are moments that feel like they carry the weight of this biography in their subtext episodes where characters narrowly escape consequences, where the randomness of survival is acknowledged, where the comedy of near death and ridiculous fortune is pressed just a little bit harder than pure humor requires. Whether this is visible to a viewer who does not know MacFarlane's biography is genuinely uncertain, but for the viewer who does know, certain frames and certain beats in the show carry an additional resonance. The show is made by a man who survived something devastating by 10 minutes, and that survival happened to produce one of the longest-running animated comedies in American television history. The show that exists because of that 10 minutes is itself a kind of hidden detail in the story of American pop culture, something that might not have been here at all had the travel arrangements worked out slightly differently. There is a reason that people fall asleep to this show, and it is not just because it is long, or because it is familiar, or because the cadences of it have been absorbed into the furniture of late-night television over 25 years. It is because the show at its best has this quality of depth of being exactly what it appears to be on the surface, and also being something else entirely underneath, for the viewer who is willing to look. There is always more in the frame. There is always something in the corner of the image that is doing something other than decoration. There is always another layer. You can spend years watching this show and still be surprised. Stewie is still building weapons in that room down the hall. Brian's bumper sticker is still making its quiet political argument on a car that will never quite reach its destination. Peter is still the descended founder of a town that has mostly forgotten this fact. And in every episode, without fail, someone says, "What the hell?" which seems, all things considered, like the correct response to being alive. If you made it all the way here, if you fell asleep somewhere around section 4 and are just waking up to these final words, thank you for spending this time in Quahog with me. Family Guy is a show that has given us more than it probably knows, and tonight I hope it gave you rest. If this video was something you enjoyed, please do hit the like button and consider subscribing. It is completely free. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who would appreciate this kind of deep dive content, and it means I can keep going further into the details and the lore and the stories hiding just beneath the surface of the shows we have grown up watching. I will see you in the next one. Sleep well. End of script. Section 13. The music, the sound, and the things you hear without knowing you hear them. There is a category of hidden detail in Family Guy that operates on a frequency most viewers never consciously tune into, and that is sound. The visual Easter eggs get all the discussion, the block spelling red rum, the upside-down text, the faces hidden in star fields, but Family Guy's audio landscape is equally layered with deliberate choices that reward the attentive ear. And because most people watch television with their eyes rather than their ears, the audio details have largely remained undiscovered by the general fan community. Walter Murphy is the composer most closely associated with Family Guy's musical identity, and his contribution to the show is genuinely underappreciated in most discussions of what makes the show work. Murphy is a classically trained musician who had a career before Family Guy, most notably. He arranged and produced the 1976 disco hit A Fifth of Beethoven, an adaptation of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony that reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Murphy brought that same sensibility for taking classic musical forms and finding new contexts for them to Family Guy's scoring. And the result is a show whose music is doing significantly more sophisticated work than most animated comedies of its era. The scoring choices in Family Guy are frequently counterintuitive in ways that generate comedy without ever announcing themselves as comedy. In scenes where the dramatic content is clearly trivial, Murphy often writes music that treats it as genuinely important, lush, sweeping orchestral accompaniment for a scene about Peter doing something embarrassingly stupid. This tonal mismatch between the emotional register of the music and the emotional register of the scene is a comedic technique that works best when the gap between the two is large, and Murphy consistently found ways to make that gap as wide as possible. The joke is never, "Look how seriously this music takes this dumb thing." The joke is that the music is fully committed to its own register while the scene is fully committed to its own, and neither one acknowledges the other. The comedy lives in the silence between them. The show also uses music as a form of embedded pop culture reference that operates independently of the dialogue references. In scenes where characters are at parties, in cars, in public spaces where music would plausibly be playing, the tracks selected for the background are almost never random. They are specific choices made by the music department that relate to something else in the episode, either the theme of the episode, the emotional state of the character in the scene, or a callback to an earlier cultural reference that the episode has already deployed. Most viewers hear this music as wallpaper because it is not in the foreground and because the dialogue is competing with it for attention. But if you watch an episode with the dialogue muted and focus on the background music choices, you will find a running commentary on the scene's content that was always there. The Wilhelm scream appears in Family Guy multiple times across the series, placed by sound designers who were participating in the century-long tradition of hiding this specific sound effect inside films and television shows as a private joke shared between sound professionals. The scream, recorded in 1951 for the Western film Distant Drums, has been used in hundreds of productions and is considered a kind of informal membership card in the community of film and television sound work. You put it in your project because you know about it and you want the people who also know about it to know that you know. Family Guy uses it this way, deliberately and knowingly, and it appears in episodes where the context makes it detectable if you are specifically listening for it. The show's relationship to musical theater is another audio layer that runs through its entire history in ways that most casual viewers have never fully mapped. MacFarlane's deep personal affinity for the golden age of Broadway, for the compositional world of Rodgers and Hammerstein and Leonard Bernstein, expresses itself in the show's recurring musical numbers. These numbers are not, as some viewers assume, just comedy set pieces. They are technically sophisticated pieces of musical theater writing in their own right, properly harmonized, properly orchestrated, proper transitions from spoken dialogue to song in the tradition of the integrated musical. When Peter and the gang break into a full Broadway-style number in an episode, the quality of the musical writing is considerably higher than a casual observer typically registers. Because the joke of a cartoon family doing Broadway tends to overshadow the fact that the Broadway being done is actually being done well. Family Guy's theme song is worth examining as an audio document of the show's self-understanding. The opening lyric, "It seems today that all you see is violence in movies and sex on TV," is a line delivered with a cheerful, deliberately ironic breeziness that announces the show's relationship to its own content before a single episode has played. The show is immediately telling you that it knows exactly what it is, that it has heard the criticism of shows like itself, and that it finds that criticism both valid and irrelevant to what it is doing. The theme then pivots to, but where are those good old-fashioned values on which we used to rely? And the answer implied by the transition to the family scene with Peter and Lois at the piano is right here, and also nowhere. The show is simultaneously sincere and ironic about its own relationship to traditional family values, and it encodes both positions into the opening 30 seconds of every episode. The sound design for Stewie's weapons is a category of audio detail that has received essentially no critical attention, but which rewards examination. Each of Stewie's major inventions has its own sonic signature, and those signatures are maintained across different episodes in which the same device appears. The time machine has a specific warm electric sound. The laser gun has a specific high frequency. The mind control device has a lower, more resonant tone. These are not random choices, they are consistent design decisions that give Stewie's armory an audio coherence that mirrors the visual consistency of his room's design. If you close your eyes during a Stewie episode and hear these sounds, you can identify which device he is using without seeing the image. The audio environment of the Griffin house itself contains a level of ambient detail that most viewers filter out entirely. The hum of the refrigerator in kitchen scenes, the particular frequency of the television in the living room, the ambient street noise from outside the house that changes slightly depending on which direction the scene suggests the window faces. These are details that the sound design team placed in the mix because they were thinking about what would make the house feel inhabited and real, and while no individual viewer would notice the refrigerator hum and think, "What a clever audio detail," the cumulative effect of all these ambient sounds is a space that feels occupied in a way that it would not without them. One of the most discussed Family Guy audio details in production circles is the specific quality of Quagmire's giggity. The sound itself, that two-syllable expression of appreciation for something sexually suggestive, has a specific vocal texture that MacFarlane developed and refined in the early seasons. What most people do not know is that the word is vocally produced by MacFarlane using a specific set of oral resonances that were themselves deliberate choices, rather than accidental discoveries. MacFarlane has described the challenge of maintaining consistency in Quagmire's voice across many seasons as one of the more technically demanding aspects of voicing the character, because Quagmire's vocal placement is genuinely far from his natural register. The giggity, as a signature vocalization, requires MacFarlane to maintain that placement precisely to preserve the word's specific quality. The audio of the chicken fights is another place where careful listening reveals hidden craft. Each successive chicken fight in the series is mixed differently with different acoustic textures, different levels of ambient sound relative to the fight sounds, different musical cues underneath. This is not accidental variation caused by different production staff handling different episodes. It is a deliberate escalation strategy that mirrors the visual escalation of the fights themselves. Just as the fights get bigger and more destructive with each iteration, the audio mix gets denser and more bombastic, with the sound design communicating scale through frequency and volume in ways that reinforce the visual information. Section 14. The Simpsons Relationship, a hidden conversation across 25 years. The relationship between Family Guy and The Simpsons is one of the most publicly documented creative relationships in American animated television history, and yet it contains layers of hidden texture that most discussions of it never reach. The surface version of this relationship is simple. The Simpsons is the template that adult animated comedy was built on. Family Guy arrived in 1999 to occupy a similar cultural space. Comparisons were inevitable, and the relationship between the two shows has varied between mutual respect and barely concealed tension depending on who was talking and when. But underneath that surface version is something more interesting. Family Guy's relationship to The Simpsons, when you read it through the lens of what is hidden in the show's visual and audio details, is more like an ongoing private conversation between two shows that know each other very well, a conversation that uses reference, parody, tribute, and occasional pointed commentary to say things that neither show would say directly. From the very beginning, MacFarlane was aware that Family Guy would be compared to The Simpsons, and he was aware that the comparison would not favor him in every way. The Simpsons had a decade of cultural ground that Family Guy could not claim. It had critical esteem, award recognition, and a place in the culture that made it essentially untouchable in terms of legacy. MacFarlane was building in the shadow of something that had already defined the genre, and his response to this situation was complex. On the surface, he acknowledged the influence. In the actual texture of the show, he was doing something different enough from The Simpsons that the comparison, while inevitable, was never quite accurate. The hidden Simpsons references in Family Guy operate at several levels. The most visible are the explicit parodies and direct comparisons that the show stages in episodes that are explicitly about The Simpsons or that include Simpsons characters as guests. But there is a second category of reference that is less visible: the visual echoes and structural parallels that exist in Family Guy's format and design without ever being explicitly acknowledged. The way the show handles certain kinds of character vulnerability, the specific tonal register that it adopts for moments of genuine family connection as opposed to the register it uses for pure comedy. The decision to make the family's home the central recurring setting, with the exterior of the house used as a visual anchor for the show's sense of stability. These are choices that The Simpsons made first and that Family Guy inherited, and while they are standard features of the genre that both shows help define, their presence in Family Guy is a form of hidden tribute that exists in the show's structural DNA. The moment in the Family Guy and Simpsons crossover episode where Homer throws Emmy awards at Peter, and Peter has nothing to throw back with because Family Guy has not won that award, is the most explicit version of the status anxiety that runs through Family Guy's entire relationship with its predecessor. But it is also, by the time it was filmed, an anxiety that had been transformed into a comfortable joke, the kind of joke you can only make once you have stopped feeling the anxiety earnestly. The show had been in production long enough by the time of the crossover that the Emmy deficit could be treated as a running gag rather than a genuine competitive wound. In the background of certain crowd scenes in episodes set in Quahog that depict large gatherings, there are background characters who are drawn with design elements that loosely reference The Simpsons' character design vocabulary without ever being clearly identifiable as Simpsons characters. A character with a recognizable silhouette, a figure with color choices that evoke a specific Springfield resident, a background shape that seems to quote another show without committing to the reference. These are the kinds of details that exist in a plausible deniability zone. They could be coincidences, or they could be deliberate visual quotations that the show is making while maintaining the ability to disclaim them. Either way, they reward the viewer who has enough visual vocabulary in both shows to register the parallel. The Simpsons' own treatment of Family Guy in its episodes, the occasional Simpsons jokes about Family Guy, the Simpsons game's reference to MacFarlane, the competitive needling that runs both ways creates a situation where two shows that exist in the same cultural space are continuously commenting on each other in ways that their audiences partially decode and partially miss. The hidden version of this conversation is the one that requires knowing both shows well enough to read what is being said in the visual grammar rather than the explicit dialogue. Section 15. The Road to Episodes, a hidden universe of their own. The Road to Episodes of Family Guy constitute a mini-series within the series, a specific subset of episodes that have their own visual language, their own tonal register, and their own cache of hidden details that are distinct from the details of the regular episodes. If you approach them as a connected body of work rather than as individual episodes, they reveal a level of care and deliberateness that is not always visible in the broader sweep of the show's production. The Road to series began with Road to Rhode Island in Season 2, which aired on the 30th of May 2000. In this first entry, Brian is sent to retrieve Stewie from Lois's parents' vacation home in Palm Springs, and the two of them end up having to make their way back across the country by any means available. The structure of the episode is explicitly a parody of the Old Bob Hope and Bing Crosby Road To film series from the 1940s and 1950s, a series of buddy comedies in which the two stars traveled together to exotic locations and got into adventures involving women, villains, and musical numbers. The Family Guy Road To episodes adopt this structure wholesale, including the musical numbers, and use it as a vehicle for the Brian and Stewie dynamic in ways that allow for a different kind of characterization than the main episodes provide. Within Road to Rhode Island, one of the most interesting hidden details is a piece of foreshadowing that operates almost as a character prediction rather than a plot foreshadow. In a scene where Brian and Stewie are sleeping on a train, Brian unconsciously licks Stewie, and Stewie, half asleep, says, "That's it, Mr. Giraffe. Get all the marmalade." This moment is a throwaway joke on the surface, a baby talking in his sleep about a stuffed giraffe. But in the context of the road that Stewie's characterization was about to travel, the shift from pure villain to something more emotionally complex, more comfortable with being cared for, more genuinely bonded to Brian, this sleepy vulnerability reads retroactively as the first visible moment of who Stewie was becoming. The evil genius, even in this early episode, can be lulled into unguarded tenderness by the presence of the dog he has been assigned to. The subsequent Road To episodes build on each other in ways that require you to have seen the preceding entries to fully appreciate. Musical motifs from early Road To episodes recur in later ones. Character beats that were established in one Road To episode get revisited and developed in subsequent entries. There is a specific quality of intimacy in the Brian and Stewie relationship that exists only in the Road To episodes, and that does not fully transfer to the regular episode format, the adventures that these two characters go on. Together, the places and times they visit, the conversations they have in moments of genuine privacy, constitute a relationship arc that is entirely separate from, and more emotionally developed, than the version of their relationship that the regular episodes portray. The musical numbers in the Road To episodes are particularly interesting as hidden craft. They are not parodies of specific songs in the way that a straightforward musical reference in a Family Guy episode would work. They are original compositions written specifically for these episodes, in the tradition of the musical theater genre they are drawing on, and they are technically accomplished pieces of work. Seth MacFarlane and Walter Murphy created original songs for these episodes that could legitimately stand next to the kind of music they were parodying. And the quality of the composition is one reason the Road To episodes have a different quality of humor from the standard episodes. When the musical numbers are good, the comedy that surrounds them is elevated by contrast. The Road to the Multiverse episode from Season 8 is perhaps the richest single road to entry in terms of hidden details. In this episode, Stewie and Brian travel through multiple alternate universes, each depicted in a different animation style, one as a Hanna-Barbera cartoon, one as anime, one as a Pixar-style computer animation, one as a live-action sequence. Within each alternate universe, the visual vocabulary is matched to the animation style being parodied, and within each of those styles there are specific references and details that only make sense to viewers who are fluent in the aesthetic being parodied. The Hanna-Barbera universe contains background details visible only to viewers who know specific Hanna-Barbera shows well enough to recognize what is being quoted. The anime universe contains visual gags that require knowledge of specific anime tropes and conventions to decode. The episode is a set of nested references that reward different kinds of knowledge with different levels of the joke. The Road to Germany episode, in which Mort Goldman accidentally ends up in Nazi Germany via Stewie's time machine, and Brian and Stewie have to rescue him, contains the 99 Luftballons detail already mentioned, but also contains several other historically grounded, hidden details. The visual design of the Germany depicted in the episode is drawn from specific historical reference material rather than from generic visual representations of the era. Specific architectural and decorative elements in the background of the German scenes match specific documented elements of how that period actually looked, which gives the episode's comic anachronisms. The American characters existing in 1940s. Germany, an additional layer of visual incongruity that would not be available if the setting were less carefully researched. Section 16. The Griffin's Neighborhood. What Quahog looks like when nobody's watching. Quahog's geography, as has already been established, is elastic. It expands and contracts based on what the story needs, maintains its own internal consistency on the level of feel and atmosphere rather than on the level of fixed spatial relationships, and draws on the real Providence, Rhode Island area as a source of texture and authentic reference. But within this elastic geography, there are specific recurring locations that have accumulated their own hidden histories of detail across the show's long run. The exterior establishing shot of the Griffin House is one of the most used single images in all of Family Guy's visual library. It appears at the beginning of home-based scenes, as a transition marker between sequences, as a visual reference point that orients the viewer in space. Most viewers have seen this exterior shot hundreds of times without ever examining it closely, which means most viewers have missed the details that are consistently present in it. The neighboring houses on Spooner Street have their own visual identities that the show maintains with more consistency than it maintains most other background elements. The Swanson house across the street has a specific set of characteristics. The ramp from Joe's wheelchair accessibility, the particular arrangement of the front porch, specific plantings in the front garden that are consistently present in the majority of exterior shots that include it. This consistency was clearly intentional. The Swanson house was designed to read as its own distinct personality, separate from the Griffin house, and that personality is maintained in the visual details even when the Swansons are not the focus of the story. The Drunken Clam's exterior has changed across the show's run in ways that parallel the changes in the show's own character. In the early seasons, the exterior of the bar has a quality of slightly shabby charm. It looks like a place that has been there for a while, that is well-worn in the way of bars that have served their community for years. In later seasons, the exterior is cleaner and more generic, a background asset that serves its function of establishing, "We are going to the bar now," without carrying the same quality of lived-in specificity. Whether this change was intentional or simply the result of different production teams working from different background templates across different seasons is not clear, but the change is visible and consistent with the broader shift in the show's visual quality across its production history. One of Quahog's most interesting background institutions is the various churches, civic buildings, and community spaces that recur across the show's episodes. The Quahog Church appears regularly in episodes involving the Griffin family's nominal religious life, and it has its own set of visual details that are maintained across appearances. The cemetery that appears in several episodes involving death-related plots has recurring background headstones that contain jokes for the viewer who reads them. Grave markers in animated comedies are one of those background locations where the writing team almost always puts in gags because they know that attentive viewers will pause to read what is written on them, and because the humor available from a fictional cemetery headstone is a specific and reliable form that comedy writers seem to enjoy. The Quahog Mall, the airport, the hospital, the school, and the brewery all have recurring visual identities that accumulate detail across the episodes set in them. The brewery in particular, as Peter's professional home for most of the show's run, is one of those locations that has been designed with more care than it typically receives recognition for. The Pawtucket Patriot Brewing Company has a visual identity, a brand, a logo, a consistent aesthetic for its product and its facilities that was clearly developed with some thought about what Rhode Island beer culture looks like and what the workplace that would produce this specific beer would feel like. James Woods Regional High School, as Meg's educational home, is one of the show's recurring locations with the most embedded humor in its visual details. School hallways in animated shows are backgrounds that get used extensively, and Family Guy's school hallway backgrounds contain a consistent population of background posters, notices, and decorative elements. Some of these are standard school background elements. Others are specific to the show's comedic world in ways that reward a reader who actually processes the text on the walls, rather than treating the visual information as generic institutional background. The various restaurants, cafes, and other social spaces of Quahog have their own categories of hidden detail. The Clam Shack restaurant, where the family occasionally eats out, has menu boards visible in certain episodes that contain items with names that constitute their own small comedy tradition within the show's visual world. Restaurant menus and background frames are one of those locations where the show has historically been willing to invest in specific writing humor for viewers who are paying attention, because the format of a menu lends itself naturally to a specific kind of comedy, the naming of things, the description of things, the price of things, all of which can be made funny with relatively little effort if someone is actually thinking about it. Section 17. The Decades of References. How the show uses time. One of the most distinctive qualities of Family Guy's reference landscape is that it does not primarily reference the present. Where shows like South Park tend to be contemporary in their references, reacting quickly to what is happening in the culture right now, Family Guy's reference vocabulary has always been weighted heavily toward the past, toward a specific past, the mid-century American pop culture world of the 1950s through the 1980s that MacFarlane grew up with, and has clearly never stopped loving. This temporal orientation is itself a hidden detail about the show's character, one that tells you something about who made it and why it feels the way it feels. A show whose humor is primarily drawn from references to things that happened 30 to 60 years ago is a show that was built by a person who processes the present through the lens of the past, who finds the absurdity of contemporary life most visible when it is compared to the absurdity of a historical moment that has had time to become slightly surreal in the rearview mirror. The specific decades that Family Guy loves most, if you catalog the references across the show's history, are the 1950s through the 1970s. The mid-century American moment of television's golden age and folkic band music's mainstream appeal of a specific kind of American domesticity and aspiration is the world that the show returns to most reliably for its material. Peter's relationship to movies from this era is a character trait that has been consistently maintained from the early seasons. He is a man who finds the entertainment of the 1970s and 1980s to be the high point of American popular culture, and his occasional forays into more recent cultural territory are treated with bemusement. The Star Wars reference tradition in Family Guy is its own subcategory of temporal engagement. Star Wars is a 1977 film about a universe that exists in a time more technologically advanced than our own, but culturally located in the mythology of a much older world. It is explicitly a fairy tale set among the stars, drawing on archetypes that predate cinema. Family Guy's deep engagement with Star Wars content, which produced 3 full episodes and countless individual references across the show's run, is consistent with this temporal orientation. The appeal of Star Wars for MacFarlane is the appeal of a story that comes from the past but lives permanently as a cultural present. George Lucas's specific permission for MacFarlane to use Star Wars content is one of the most interesting production details in the show's history. Lucas, who notoriously controlled the Star Wars intellectual property with extreme care and who was famously litigious about unauthorized uses of the franchise's imagery and characters, personally gave MacFarlane permission to do the Blue Harvest Star Wars special. The reason Lucas gave permission was that he was a fan of the show specifically, his son was a fan, and Lucas, by various accounts, had enjoyed watching Family Guy with his children. The special was made possible by a billionaire filmmaker's affection for an animated comedy that parodied his life's work. This is the kind of production fact that changes how you experience the Blue Harvest episode. The knowledge that the man who created the thing being parodied had seen the parody and blessed it transforms the nature of the joke in ways that are hard to articulate precisely but are definitely felt. Section 18. Meg's Arc and the Hidden Dignity. There is a category of hidden detail in Family Guy that is specifically about what the show knows and chooses not to say about Meg Griffin, and it is one of the most interesting archives of buried information in the show's history. Across roughly 10 seasons of sustained comedic mistreatment, the show was also quietly, intermittently, and almost certainly unintentionally building a portrait of a character whose fundamental dignity it refused to acknowledge in the main narrative but could not entirely suppress in the margins. The evidence of Meg's suppressed character is visible in the episodes that are widely praised as exceptions to the show's treatment of her episodes like The Simpsons crossover, where Meg meets Lisa Simpson, or Peter's sister, where her relationship with Peter gets a genuine emotional reckoning, or the occasional episodes where Meg's actual capabilities are allowed to be visible. But it is also present in smaller, less celebrated moments scattered across the episodes that are otherwise devoted to her suffering. In background frames of school scenes, in moments that the main plot has no investment in, Meg occasionally does something that suggests competence, intelligence, or social awareness that the show's primary characterization of her actively contradicts. She makes a remark that is sharper than she is supposed to be capable of. She navigates a social situation with more skill than the show generally credits her with. She reads something or creates something in the background of a scene that suggests an interior life richer than the one the show is prepared to depict. These are flashes, brief and probably unintentional, but they accumulate into something. They are the record of a character who, had the show's treatment of her been more generous, might have been one of the most fully realized people in the show's world. The hidden Meg, the Meg visible in these background moments and exceptional episodes, is a teenager trying to survive a family that has decided not to see her, which is a much more interesting story than the one the show chose to tell. Mila Kunis, who has given Meg her voice for most of the show's run, has spoken in interviews about the strange experience of lending her voice to a character who is defined by being unwanted and mocked. The dissociation between Kunis, a successful, celebrated actress, and the character she voices, a perpetual target, is itself a form of hidden detail about the show's production. Every time Meg speaks, the voice is coming from someone who has spent years bringing genuine craft to the work of inhabiting a character the show treats as disposable. Tara Strong's contribution to Meg's vocal life, providing the character's singing voice in musical episodes, is one of those details that becomes quietly moving when you think about it in the context of what Meg's musical talent represents in the show's world. Meg is occasionally depicted as having a real singing voice. In The Simpsons crossover, Lisa encourages her to pursue her musical talent. There is a version of Meg Griffin who has a gift and could develop it. The fact that this version is voiced by Tara Strong, one of the most gifted voice actresses in animation, while the primary Meg is voiced by Mila Kunis, doing a deliberately unremarkable performance, creates a split in the character's vocal identity that is itself a kind of hidden detail about the two versions of Meg that the show contains, the one it chose to show and the one it kept in reserve. Section 19, the show's relationship to its own cancellation and revival. Family Guy's experience of being canceled and then revived is something that runs through the show's text and subtext in ways that most fans have not fully mapped. This is one of the most unusual creative histories in television, a show that was genuinely killed, mourned, and then resurrected through a combination of fan passion, DVD sales, and Adult Swim rerun ratings, and the experience of that resurrection marks the show in ways that are still visible in episodes that were produced years after the revival. The revival itself was the result of several converging factors that the show references obliquely across many episodes. DVD sales exceeding 400,000 copies during the cancellation period told Fox that the audience was real and committed. Adult Swim rerun ratings that dominated the late-night cable landscape told Fox that the show had not just survived its cancellation but had grown during it. The fan campaigns and online organizing that pressured Fox to reconsider told the network that there was genuine cultural investment in the show coming back. The revival in 2005 was not a business decision made in isolation. It was a response to demonstrated and documented demand. Within the show's episodes, references to second chances, to coming back from the dead, to proving that something dismissed can still be valuable, appear across the revival-era seasons with a frequency that suggests these themes were on the minds of the people making the show. They are not always explicit. They are often buried in metaphors and jokes about other things entirely. But the pattern of their appearance, the regularity with which the show returns to themes of unexpected survival and reasserted relevance, tells you something about the emotional state of a creative team that had genuinely been through something unusual. The Luke Perry TV Guide detail already mentioned, "If you can read this, Family Guy is on the air," is perhaps the clearest single instance of this self-awareness. But it is one moment in a longer conversation that the show has with itself about the fact of its own existence. A show that has been canceled twice and revived does not take its continuation for granted in the way that a show, which has always existed, tends to. There is a specific quality of gratitude and defiance mixed together in Family Guy's revival-era content that is entirely different from the tone of shows that have never been in jeopardy. Section 20. The Final Hidden Things. What lives in the spaces the show has never quite filled. Every show that runs long enough eventually develops what could be called white space, the territory it keeps approaching and then retreating from. The details it plants without ever paying off, the promises it makes to itself and then does not keep. Family Guy has accumulated a significant amount of white space across its run, and within that white space are some of the most interesting hidden details of all. The ghosts of stories the show never fully told. Stewie's relationship with his biological ancestry is one of those white spaces. The show established relatively early that Stewie is descended, on Lois's side, from Leonardo da Vinci, the Italian Renaissance polymath who was among the greatest painter-scientists who ever lived. This detail, if it were ever fully explored, would explain a great deal about Stewie's capabilities and ambitions. A baby who can build a working time machine and a weather control device and a fully functional transporter from Star Trek is a baby with an extraordinary genetic legacy, and that legacy has a traceable source. But the show planted this detail and never really did anything with it, leaving it as a piece of background information that raises more questions than it answers. Lois's background as a former model and her history with the Pewterschmidt family's wealth and social world similarly contains more story than the show has ever fully examined. There are episodes that visit this territory, that show glimpses of who Lois was before she was Peter Griffin's wife and the Griffin children's mother. But the full version of that story, the one that would explain the complete arc of how this particular woman made the particular choices that brought her to Spooner Street, has never been told. Brian's relationship with his original family, with the farm where he was born and the human family that raised him before Peter brought him home, is territory that the show has visited exactly once, memorably and movingly, in Road to Rhode Island, when Brian returns to find his mother and confronts a specific loss that the episode handles with genuine emotional weight. That one episode established a backstory for Brian that could have generated years of additional story material. The show chose not to pursue it, and the result is a single episode that stands as a monument to what Family Guy could do when it chose to, surrounded by seasons of content that seem largely unaware that this territory was ever visited. Chris Griffin's relationship to art, his genuine talent as a visual artist, established early in the show's run and referenced occasionally in later episodes, is another piece of white space. Chris's ability to draw, to make things with his hands, to see the world in visual terms that have genuine depth, was clearly intended as a character trait that would be developed over time. In certain early episodes, there is a quality of care given to Chris's artistic moments that suggests the writers had real ideas about what this character's relationship to his own creativity could become. That relationship was never fully explored. These white spaces are themselves a form of hidden detail, if you approach them as such. They are the visible outlines of roads, not taken the evidence of stories that were begun and then abandoned, of character dimensions that were hinted at and then allowed to atrophy. The careful viewer who notices these outlines is seeing something that most viewers never consciously register. The show that Family Guy could have been, existing as a ghost inside the show that Family Guy actually became. In the episodes where the show does chase one of these threads, where it picks up a piece of established backstory or follows through on a character implication that had been sitting dormant for years, there is a specific quality of recognition and reward. The long game joke or the paid-off character detail feels different from the show's more spontaneous humor. It carries the weight of accumulated time. It is funnier or sadder or more resonant because of everything that preceded it. That is the final hidden detail of Family Guy, and perhaps the most universal one. The show is richer for being long. Not always better length does not equal quality, and the show's decline in certain seasons is real but richer. There is more to find in a show that has been running for 25 years than there is in a show that has been running for 3. More accumulated detail, more white space, more ghosts, more layers. The early seasons were sharper and more concentrated. But the full archive, taken together, is a different kind of object from any individual era of it. It is a map of what one creative team's relationship to their own creation looks like across decades. And that map has details in its corners that nobody has fully finished exploring. The sound of the show is all around you right now. The Griffin family is still in the house on Spooner Street. Stewie is still working on something in his room. Brian is at his desk with a book open on his lap. Peter is looking at something on the television with an expression of complete absorption. Lois is in the kitchen, holding things together. There is always one more detail you have not noticed yet. That is the promise the show makes every time you watch it. And it has kept that promise for 25 years. Thank you for being here tonight. Leave me a comment with wherever you're watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely read every single one. Hit subscribe if this is the kind of content you want more of. And until next time, take care of yourself out there. Sleep well. End of script, total content complete. Bonus section, deep character archaeology. The details that built Quagmire, Joe, Cleveland, and the rest. The supporting cast of Family Guy has always been a second library of hidden details running parallel to the main Griffin family archive, and it deserves a full examination in its own right. Glenn Quagmire, whose full biography the show has filled in across many episodes in pieces that do not always fit together neatly, contains more hidden biographical texture than most viewers have assembled into a coherent picture. The pilot episode establishes Quagmire as simply Peter's neighbor and friend, a man with an obvious weakness for women and a cheerful disregard for conventional social boundaries. But across the show's run, specific details accumulate around Quagmire that give him a history. He is a military veteran. He served in the Navy, which is consistent with his work as a commercial airline pilot. Naval aviation is one of the pipeline routes to commercial flight. There is a version of Glenn Quagmire that, if you assembled all the biographical details the show has distributed across many seasons, would look significantly more complex than the surface characterization suggests. He is a man with genuine professional accomplishment, genuine military service, and a personal life that is genuinely chaotic. The surface version of Quagmire, the running joke in a turtleneck, is a simplification of a character who has been built out more carefully in the background of many episodes than he typically receives credit for. The moment in the episode Jerome is the New Black, where Quagmire delivers his speech about why he hates Brian, is one of the most carefully constructed single scenes in the show's history. What makes the speech work as well as it does is that every accusation it contains is verifiable by specific episodes. Quagmire does not say anything about Brian that the show has not already shown to be true. He is not making up a characterization. He is delivering a summary of documented events, and the accumulated weight of that documentation is what gives the speech its rhetorical force. The speech is not character work in the conventional sense, Quagmire saying this does not tell us something new about Brian. It tells us that the show was aware of everything Brian had become, that somewhere in the production process, someone had been keeping track, and that this tracking had been assembled into a verdict. Joe Swanson's disability is handled across the show's history with a level of consistency in certain respects and a level of inconsistency in others that itself constitutes a form of hidden information. In the early seasons, Joe's disability is present and acknowledged, but not treated as a constant source of comedy. Joe is capable, active, and respected, and his wheelchair is a fact about him rather than a punchline about him. As the show's treatment of Joe changes in later seasons as he becomes more of a comedic target and less of a respected community member, his disability shifts in function from a character fact to a comedy device, and this shift is visible in how the visual design of his scenes changes. The camera relationship to Joe's wheelchair, the way other characters relate to it visually within the frame, the frequency with which it becomes the focus of a joke rather than the context for a scene, all of these change in measurable ways across the show's seasons. Cleveland Brown's exit from the main cast for the Cleveland Show spin-off is a transition that the show handles with more care than is often recognized. The lead-up to Cleveland's departure, the episodes in which his relationship with Donna and his situation in Quahog are developed in ways that create the conditions for the move, constitutes a mini arc of hidden foreshadowing. The Cleveland Show's premise was being seeded in Family Guy episodes that aired before the spin-off was announced, at least in the sense that Cleveland's motivations and emotional situation were being developed in directions that pointed clearly toward change. Whether this was deliberate pre-seeding of the spin-off, or simply the natural consequence of Cleveland being given more character development than the show typically gave its supporting players is debatable, but the result is the same. The transition, when it came, felt earned in a way that it would not have if the preceding episodes had not been doing the quiet work of making Cleveland's reasons for leaving legible. The recurring background characters of Quahog Mort Goldman, Consuela the cleaning woman, Meg's friend Ruth, the evil monkey, Adam West, the various one-episode characters who nonetheless have distinctive enough designs that they get reused in background crowd scenes, constitute their own visual vocabulary within the show's world. Careful viewers of crowd scenes in public settings will recognize faces from completely different episodes and contexts showing up as background extras because the show's background design uses a finite library of recurring character designs for crowd population. This is standard practice in animation, but Family Guy's specific roster of recurring background faces has accumulated enough individual episodes and individual moments that many of them have developed distinct visual identities recognizable to long-term viewers. The person in the background of a crowd scene who you vaguely recognize from somewhere else is not a different character. It is the same visual template being deployed again, and the recognition you feel is genuine. The Herbert the Pervert character, voiced by Mike Henry, is one of those supporting characters whose repeated appearance across many seasons has accumulated a texture that goes beyond the simple surface joke. Herbert is a very old man who harbors an attraction to teenage boys, particularly to Chris, and his appearances in episodes typically involve him being in proximity to Chris and making comments that the adults around him either do not notice or do not process correctly. The character is uncomfortable by design. The joke exists in the tension between the surface innocence of an old man and the darker content of his actual interest. But Herbert's recurring presence also adds something to the show's portrait of Quahog as a community. He is one of the town's many individuals whose inner life is significantly at odds with their surface presentation, and the neighborhood's apparent failure to notice him or act on what he clearly represents is a running comment on how much people choose not to see. Dr. Hartman, the Griffin family physician, played by a voice actor who gives him a kind of cheerful professional incompetence, has appeared in enough episodes across the show's run to have accumulated his own hidden medical history. The specific instances of Hartman's malpractice and medical confusion across many episodes, if assembled into a complete file, would constitute a record of professional failure that would have resulted in the revocation of his license long before the show's timeline would suggest. Yet Hartman continues to practice. He remains the Griffin family's doctor. The town continues to bring him their medical needs. His persistent presence as the community's physician, despite his consistent documented failures, is one of those running background commentaries on Quahog as a community that the show never makes explicit but that accumulates across seasons into something that reads as genuine social observation. Bonus section. The writer's room details what happens when the show writes about itself. Family Guy has always been aware that it is Family Guy. This meta-awareness, the show's knowledge of its own existence as a television program, its willingness to break the fourth wall, its references to its own production history and status, is more systematically deployed than it might appear from individual episodes, and it contains its own layer of hidden detail. The show's self-referential moments range from the obvious to the deeply subtle. The obvious end includes direct fourth-wall breaks where characters address the audience, explicit references to the show's cancellation and revival history, and jokes that require you to know something about the show's production to understand. The subtle end includes visual details and backgrounds that make sense only if you understand something about how the show is made, dialogue choices that echo real conversations that happened in the writer's room, and structural choices that comment on the show's own format in ways that are invisible unless you are paying very close attention. The Holden Caulfield character, referenced in the Watch Mojo coverage of the show's hidden details, is a figure who appears across several episodes harassing Peter and calling him a phony. While not an official name in the show's continuity, both fans and production staff have referred to this character by this name after the protagonist of The Catcher in the Rye, who has a compulsive need to call out phoniness wherever he finds it. The character appears whenever Peter is engaged in some form of pretension or performance, and his accusations of phoniness are always directed at Peter's specific situational dishonesty rather than at Peter's general character. Whether this was a deliberate catcher in the rye reference embedded in a recurring character, or a coincidental naming convention that stuck after someone noticed the resemblance, the character functions consistently as a literary allusion that rewards the viewer who has the reference frame to place it. The show's treatment of its own Emmy Award history, or lack thereof, is a running thread of self-deprecating humor that expresses itself in various ways across many episodes. Family Guy was nominated for the Outstanding Comedy Series Emmy in 2009, becoming the first animated show to receive that nomination since The Flintstones in 1961, which is a genuinely significant piece of award history. But the show has not won, and its comparative award drought relative to The Simpsons is a detail that the show references periodically in ways that are simultaneously self-aware and slightly wounded. The Homer chucking Emmys scene in The Simpsons crossover is the most explicit version of this, but smaller references appear in background television sets, in passing dialogue, and in the occasional meta moment where the show acknowledges its own position in the critical conversation about animated comedy. Steve Callahan, the show's executive producer for many seasons, is one of those production figures whose presence in the show's history is embedded in details that casual viewers would never attribute to a specific person. The animated version of his daughter appearing at Meg's slumber party has already been mentioned. But Callahan's overall influence on the show's tone and direction across the seasons when he was most central to its production is also visible in more systemic ways in the specific kinds of stories the show chose to tell. In the specific way it balanced its comedy against its occasional attempts at emotional depth in the register it adopted for its most ambitious episodes. Production executives shape shows in ways that are invisible to viewers but legible to people who know the history. The writing staff of Family Guy across its full history includes names that have appeared in various forms within the show's content. The character Neil Goldman, as established, shares his name with a real writer. Other writer names appear in slightly disguised forms in character names, location names, and in-episode credits for things like fictional books and television programs that appear within episodes. This tradition of hiding production staff references within the show's text is not unique to Family Guy. It is common practice in long-running series, but Family Guy's specific examples are more widely distributed and more varied in form than most shows attempt. The show's use of its own production codes as Easter eggs and background props constitutes a category of very deep hidden detail. Production codes are internal identifiers used by the studio to organize episodes, and in the Family Guy system, they follow a specific alphanumeric convention. In certain episodes, documents visible in background frames, clipboards, files, papers on desks contain numbers that correspond to specific production codes for other episodes. This means that within the visual world of Family Guy, it is theoretically possible to find references to specific other episodes encoded into background props. Whether anyone has ever compiled a complete cross-reference of these codes to their corresponding episodes is uncertain, but the structure exists within the show's visual archive. The two-episode test pattern that ran in the show's early history, in which certain episodes were aired out of production order, created a specific kind of continuity oddity that the show has never fully addressed. Episodes that were produced early in the show's history sometimes aired late, and episodes produced later sometimes aired earlier, creating situations where character relationships or plot developments visible in the aired episode do not match the production chronology. The most famous of these is related to the pilot's specific details. There are elements of the aired pilot that were not present in the original 15-minute pitch version, but that were added specifically for broadcast, and the distinction between what was in the original pitch and what was added for air is itself a form of hidden history. The fact that nearly every episode has an alternate unaired cut the DVD or streaming version with content that was edited for broadcast means that for most of the show's run, there have been two parallel versions of Family Guy in existence simultaneously, the broadcast version and the complete version. Most discussions of the show's content treat the broadcast version as canonical, but the complete versions contain scenes and jokes that change the meaning or tone of certain episodes in ways that are significant. The hidden content of Family Guy is not just in the Easter eggs and background details of the episodes that aired, it is in the content that was cut for broadcast and exists only in the alternate version. A final note on watching closely. There is something quietly profound about the kind of viewing that this type of content encourages. The willingness to slow down, the patience to sit with a single frame, the decision to look at the corner of the image rather than the center. These are not common viewing habits in an era of fast content and automatic playback. They require choosing to be somewhere other than where the show's pacing and editing are trying to take you. Family Guy rewards this choice in abundance. The show has spent 25 years building a world that is richer than it needs to be, more detailed than most viewers will ever fully see, more carefully constructed in its margins than its general reputation for chaos and excess would suggest. The hidden details are not accidents. They are investments made by writers, animators, sound designers, and production staff who chose to do more than was required, who put things into the corners of frames and the margins of background art that they knew most viewers would never find. Finding them, one by one, over months and years of careful watching, is one of the pleasures of being a really dedicated viewer of this show. Each detail you discover is a small confirmation that the people who made this were paying attention, that someone cared enough about this world to fill it with things nobody asked for and most people will never notice. That care is worth honoring. That is what we have been doing tonight. Sleep well, the last thing before you go. There is one more detail that nobody talks about, and it lives not in the show itself but in the relationship between the show and the person watching it. Family Guy has been on television since the 31st of January 1999. If you were 10 years old when it premiered, you are in your mid-30s now. If you were a teenager discovering it on Adult Swim reruns in 2003 or 2004, you have had more than 20 years of living since that time. The show has been a constant or at least a recurring presence in the background of the lives of anyone who has followed it since the beginning, and that constancy is itself a form of hidden meaning. The show that you watch today is not the same show you watched 10 or 15 years ago, not because the show itself has not changed, but because you have changed, and the things you are watching for and noticing and responding to are different. The hidden details visible to you now are different from the hidden details that would have been visible to you at a different point in your life. The lowest piano detail lands differently when you are old enough to understand something about what it means to have a skill you do not get to practice. The Brian safety deposit box detail lands differently when you have had years to understand something about the distance people create between themselves and their own worst impulses. The Meg details land differently when you have lived long enough to know what it means to be a person whose environment refuses to see them clearly. The show accumulates meaning with time, the way a place accumulates memory. Not because it gets deeper in itself, but because the people who return to it keep bringing more with them. That is the real hidden detail of Family Guy. The show is a container. You are what fills it. And every time you come back to it, even in a half-asleep state, even letting it wash over you without really watching, even just hearing the theme song from another room, you are in a conversation with every version of yourself that has ever sat in front of it before, with the person you were when you first found it, with the details you have found along the way and the ones you have not found yet. The credits roll. The house on Spooner Street goes dark. Stewie is presumably still down the hall, building something. You can always come back tomorrow. Sleep well. Script complete. Supplemental. The animation studios and what changed between them. One of the most consistently under-examined categories of hidden detail in Family Guy's production history is the visual signature left by the different animation studios that have handled the show's production across its many seasons. Most viewers experience Family Guy as a visually consistent show. They recognize the characters immediately, the color palette is familiar, the design language has a continuity that persists across decades. But for the attentive viewer who is looking at the actual quality of movement, expression, and background design across different eras of the show, the transitions between animation studios are legible. They leave marks. Rough Draft Studios handled seasons 2 and 3 of Family Guy, and the episodes they produced during that period are the ones most frequently cited by longtime fans as having the best animation in the show's history. This is not just nostalgia talking. The Rough Draft seasons have a specific quality of life in the character movement that comes from the studio's particular approach to the weight and momentum of animated figures. Characters in Rough Draft episodes move with a looseness that feels natural rather than mechanical when Peter falls down. The fall has a specific quality of mass meeting gravity that communicates weight. When Brian turns his head, The movement has a slightly more complex arc than strictly necessary, giving the impression of a creature with actual musculature making an actual decision about how to move through space. This quality of life in the animation is not merely aesthetic. It affects how jokes land. Physical comedy is dependent on the precise relationship between action and timing, and when the action feels alive, when the movement has genuine physical logic underlying it, the timing of the physical joke is more legible to the viewer's subconscious understanding of how bodies work. The early Family Guy physical comedy lands better partly because the animation is better, and the animation is better partly because Rough Draft was doing something specific with character movement that subsequent studios either did not replicate or chose not to attempt. The transition to digital animation for later seasons brought the shift in visual quality that has been documented extensively in fan discussions. Digital animation style was technically cleaner but visually flatter. The characters maintained their design accuracy more consistently, but the sense of life in the movement decreased. The outlines became more uniform. The facial expressions were executed accurately but with less expressiveness at the micro level. The subtle shifts in a character's face that communicate emotional states beneath the explicit expression registered less clearly. The backgrounds became more standardized. Whether these changes affected the comedy in measurable ways is a subjective question, but the argument can be made that the physical comedy of the later seasons, particularly the extended slapstick sequences involving Peter, is less funny than comparable sequences from the early seasons, not only because the jokes are constructed differently, but because the animation communicates the physical reality of the situation with less precision. A gag that depends on the audience feeling the weight of an impact requires animation that communicates weight, and animation that has shifted toward a flatter, more controlled visual register is less equipped to do that communication. Within the visual records of episodes from different eras, the animation signature changes are readable in specific types of scenes. Crowd scenes, which require many figures to be in motion simultaneously, show the most variance between production eras, because crowd animation is an area where different studios' approaches to background figure movement differ significantly. Reaction shots, where a character's face has to communicate a complex emotional response to something, also show significant variance between eras, because facial animation is one of the areas most dependent on the individual animator's judgment about how much information to put into a face. Close-up shots of hands, a detail most viewers never consciously process, vary considerably between production eras in ways that tell a story about the different studios' approaches to the level of anatomical specificity they brought to background character detail. In the Rough Draft episodes, hands have a specific quality of articulation that makes them read as hands rather than hand-shaped appendages. In later production eras, hands tend to be slightly simpler in their construction, slightly less specifically hand-like. This is a very small thing, and nobody watching Family Guy for entertainment is watching the hands. But it is visible, and it is evidence of the cumulative difference between production eras that careful visual analysis can surface. The specific character of Peter's glasses is another animation detail category worth examining. The glasses, their precise shape, the way they sit on his face, the way they interact with his expressions vary between animation studios in ways that are visible if you compare screenshots from different production eras. In the Rough Draft seasons, the glasses have a slightly more organic relationship to Peter's face. They sit on it in a way that accounts for the specific geometry of his nose and cheekbones. In later productions, the glasses become a more standardized graphic element that is placed on the face with less attention to the specific topography of where they would actually rest. This is a tiny thing, but it is the kind of tiny thing that adds up across thousands of frames, into the sense that the character feels slightly more or less real depending on which era you are in. The backgrounds of the drunken clam interior in the Rough Draft seasons have a specific quality of ambient detail. The visible wear on the bar surface, the specific arrangement of bottles behind the bar, the texture of the floor that gives the space a sense of age and use that it loses in later production eras when the background design becomes more standardized. A bar that looks like a real bar that people have been sitting in for years communicates something different from a bar that looks like a competent animated rendering of a generic bar, and the difference between those two things is measurable in specific visual choices made by the teams working on the backgrounds. The value of attending to these animation quality differences is not primarily aesthetic, although the early animation is genuinely more pleasurable to watch in technical terms. The primary value is that it allows you to understand the show as a production rather than merely a text, to read the visual record for evidence of the conditions under which different episodes were made. The animation quality is a kind of temperature reading of the production when it is high. It indicates a studio and a production process that were fully engaged and well-resourced. When it drops, it indicates either a production under pressure or a handoff to a different team with different capabilities and different priorities. This kind of reading is possible across the show's entire run, if you know what to look for. Every episode is a document not just of its story content, but of its own making. The hidden details of how Family Guy was produced are embedded in every frame of every episode for the viewer who has learned to see them.